From ancient phenomena to modern-day mysteries, people have been captivated by the unknown. Occasionally, the truth will be revealed when the pieces of the puzzle finally fit together. The first complete Einstein ring, referred to as B1938666, was found by astronomers at the University of Manchester and NASA's Hubble Space Telescope back in 1998. Other rings of this type were found before, but none of them had been a complete circle. Initially, the Einstein rings were predicted by Albert Einstein's theory of relativity. They were found to be luminous halos that were made by an event known as gravitational lensing, which occurs when light from an object is warped around the foreground object that's situated between the distant object and the observer. The light appears as though it's being bent, but it's actually traveling in a straight line through space-time and has been warped by the object's mass. Since then, more such rings have been discovered, including a 2023 discovery of a distant galaxy surrounded by one of these halos. Except it appears to be a lot heftier than the others and is denser than it should be. It was found by the James Webb Space Telescope and was named the JWST-ER1. It's made of two parts, the luminous ring made of light from a further galaxy, which is the JWST-ER1R, and the second part being the foreground object, called JWST-ER1G. This galaxy is estimated to be 21 billion light-years from Earth, which makes it the most distant lensed object ever to be found. It was estimated that JWST-ER1 is 10.3 billion years old, or occurred 3.4 billion years after the Big Bang. At the time of its discovery, researchers took note that it appeared to be unusually dense. The size and shape of the ring that circles the galaxy had suggested that its mass was around 650 billion suns, which is exceptionally high for one of that size. It's believed that dark matter may be responsible for this mystery. Researchers suggested that the dark matter likely makes up a large portion of the mass. Dark matter is a form of matter that does not interact with light, but makes up 85% of all the matter in the universe. Even with the substance accounted for, though, the galaxy still seemed to be too massive. A new study, solving the mystery, has been published in the astrophysical journal Letters. A new team of researchers proposed a well-received explanation for the unusual mass of JWST-ER1G. A halo of dark matter that surrounds the formation is being compressed into a tighter space as normal matter, such as pristine gas and stars, collapse into it. This results in a much higher density of strange substances. A second-year graduate student at UCR explained that their numerical studies revealed that this mechanism could explain the higher dark matter density of the object. More dark mass within the same volume results in a much higher density. A postdoctoral researcher at UCR had co-authored the paper. He emphasized the importance of the strong lensing object. He explained that it was unique because it was a perfect ring from which one can obtain much-needed information about the mass inside the ring, which is a critical step for testing dark matter characteristics. The professor of the team of researchers has led the analysis and proposed a compelling explanation for the unusual galaxy surrounded by the compressed dark matter. This discovery may lead to further findings and understandings of the nature of the enigmatic substance. There are a few animals that are able to live lengthy lives or seem to live forever. This may have been a mystery to many, but all the answers lie within the genetic makeup of these creatures. It's all thanks to an enzyme known as telomerase present in a eukaryote, which includes muscle cells, stem cells, and so on, which repair the telomeres, the compound structure at the end of a chromosome, in order for them to not become shorter during rounds of chromosome replication. Senescence refers to the deterioration of normal functions. When cells cease to divide, they eventually pass away, as does the organism that hosts them. Telomerase is responsible for either speeding up or slowing down such a process, hence why some animals live much longer, such as the immortal jellyfish. This is the only species that can so far be deemed biologically immortal. This is because they can revert back to an earlier life stage. Jellyfish begin their lives as a fertilized egg called planula. They then become polyps, then ephira, and finally the reproductively mature medusae. This particle jellyfish, however, has a rather unique trick. When faced with environmental stress, such as injury or starvation, It can revert back to being a planula and then into a reproductively immature polyp. Hydra, which looks rather similar to the polyp stage of the jellyfish, spend their days staying in one place, but they do not go through senescence at all. It was actually discovered that they have a particular set of genes known as FOXO-genes that play a role in how long cells live. There's an overabundance of this gene in Hydra stem cells, which is why they appear immortal. Lobsters are another species that have the ability to live for quite some time. This is due to telomerase. During the process of DNA copying and cell division, the telomeres get shorter, and once they're too short, they can no longer divide. But lobsters are found to have a never-ending supply of telomerase enzyme, which continues to regenerate telomeres. There's a catch in this case, though. The lobsters grow too big for their shells and would spend a lifetime ditching their small ones for larger ones until they finally succumb to exhaustion, predation, or shell collapse. Tortoises are another example of this. Many may have questioned why these reptiles can live so long, and the answer has finally been presented. The enzyme responsible for this, of course, is different in all species. Humans, for example, have just enough of it to give us a 70-plus year lifespan. Tortoises can live up to 80 to 150 years, with the exception of some living way past that. Saltwater crocodiles are believed to live up to 120 years. The bowhead whales are the longest living mammals with a lifespan of over 100 years. The Greenland shark, freshwater mussels, and the rough-eye rockfish all live longer than one would expect. The answer to the mystery as to why some creatures live longer than others can be found in the genetic makeup and the 1984 discovery of telomerase, which is responsible for how long cells live. For ages, astronomers have wondered how quasars are ignited. These are the celestial objects that are incredibly high in luminosity and are found in the centers of some galaxies, which are giant disks of swirling stars, dust, gas, and dark matter that have all been intricately strung together by gravity. According to NASA, these objects can sometimes be brighter than the sun itself. The quasi-stellar astronomical objects were first found in 1962, but have remained an absorbing mystery, leaving astrophysicists and astronomers searching for answers. The term quasar is a derivative of quasi-stellar radio sources, which were so called because upon their discovery, astronomers were baffled by this interstellar phenomena. Astronomers have been trying to figure out how such powerful activity could be created by this object. All that was known was that the objects were the most bright and powerful in the known universe. They were extremely distant from the Earth, but glittered as bright as trillions of stars clustered into a space as small as our solar system. It appears that the long mystery has finally found a solution. New research has come to suggest that high luminosity is the result of galaxies merging together. Scientists discovered the presence of distorted structures in the galaxies that are known to contain quasars. Data was also taken and analyzed from the Isaac Newton telescope located in La Palma. 48 quasars and their host galaxies were observed, and they were compared against images of over 100 non-quasar hosting galaxies. The middle of the galaxies are thought to be supermassive black holes that are many times denser than the Sun. All galaxies have something in the center that creates a pivot point. These galaxies contain a great amount of gas, which the black holes are unable to reach. Our Milky Way, for example, has a centrical black hole known as Sagittarius A. Of course, not every galaxy has the same center point, as some have an active galactic nucleus, or AGN, which are known to be rather volatile, such as blazars. Blazars are AGNs that project jets of ionized matter. Quasars are also an AGN that's even more intense than the blazar variety. The researchers observed that with the galaxy collisions, the gases are driven towards the black hole and are then consumed. Such an action results in an immense amount of energy in the form of radiation, which produces the characteristic luminosity of the quasar. It was also concluded that host galaxies are 3 times more likely to interact with other galaxies. Since the quasars are powered by supermassive black holes, they can occasionally belch out waves of matter that can snuff out nearby stars, and have therefore become a key aspect in understanding galaxy evolution. The ignition of these celestial objects can have a consequence for whole galaxies, though. It may drive the remaining gas out, preventing the formation of stars for billions of years. Such a discovery may also aid researchers in understanding what may happen with the Milky Way, which is expected to collide with the Andromeda Galaxy in 5 billion years, according to Professor Clive Tadhunter from the University of Sheffield's Department of Physics and Astronomy. These objects are also important to astrophysicists because of their brightness. The quasars stand out at large distances, acting as markers or beacons to the earliest epochs in the history of the entire universe. A chitin refers to a type of mollusk. They're flattened and bilaterally symmetrical and are found worldwide in warm regions. There are around 600 species that are classified as Placophora, Polyplacophora, or Loricata. Most of these creatures are about 5 centimeters in length but can grow up to 43 centimeters. The most prominent feature of the chitin is its eyes, all 1,000 of them. Their visual systems have remained a fascinating enigma ever since their discovery, but scientists have finally unraveled it. A team of scientists from UC Santa Barbara's Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Marine Biology found that some of these mollusks have the most recently evolved eyes with a lens. The 2 kinds of eyes found in the group had come from 4 completely separate evolutionary events. The team had laid out the factors that led to this arrangement in a paper that was published in a science journal. While they're all related to squids, snails, and scallops, the chitin's eyes are not located on their soft body, but rather their sensory organs can be found embedded in the segmented shells. The co-author of the paper, Daniel Spicer, from the University of Carolina, expressed that he doesn't know of any other animal that builds its eyes into its armor. These little eyes are known as esthetes, which are small sensory structures on the outermost layer of the shells. Some of these mollusk species have bulbous eyes, which are lensed with a mineral known as aragonite. Other species of chitin have smaller eye spots that function more as individual pixels, such as that of a mantis shrimp's compound eye. The question as to how these visual systems were developed and what the function of these eyes are has finally been answered by the research team. Through the research, it was discovered that the ancestors of the chitin had evolved eyes on 4 separate occasions, which resulted in the 2 distinct visual systems as so observed today. While this was not as repetitive as the sideways movements of crabs that evolved at least 5 times, the team did determine that yet again evolution had come up with multiple solutions to basic issues, such as how to make use of light to avoid becoming a meal. The team reconstructed the evolutionary history through fossil comparisons and DNA sampling. 2 visual systems evolved twice, each in quick succession. Eye spots evolved in one of the groups around 260 to 200 million years ago during the Triassic when the dinosaurs had emerged. Another group had come about in the Jurassic period, 200 to 150 million years ago. Shell eyes then evolved a second time 150 to 100 million years ago. Eye spots then evolved yet again in different chitin evolutionary branches, as late as the Paleogene era. These mollusks were found to have openings in their shell plates through which the optic nerve would pass. Species with fewer slits would evolve fewer but more complex shell eyes, and those with more slits would evolve more, yet simpler eye spots. Through another recent study, in at least one of these chitin species, the more complex eyes were found to send visual information for processing in a neural structure that is ring-shaped and travels around the whole body of the mollusk. The optic nerves that are connected to the ring sense the location of an object based on the part of the ring that's been activated. Just how well these little eye spots can see was determined through experimentation by Daniel Spicer. During the tests, the chitins were foraging under a diffused light. Without warning, dark circles of various sizes would be flashed overhead. The smaller circles would often be ignored, but upon seeing the larger circles, the creatures would clamp down. They further determined whether they were reacting to darkness or to shapes by suddenly lowering the light intensity. They hadn't reacted. It was further discovered that these creatures have lenses made of aragonite, a form of calcium carbonate. The lenses also have 2 stacked layers. Due to the way in which light travels differently in air and water, the lenses were able to focus images on the retina both in water as well as in air. This means that the chitin can be seen at high tide and low tide. After years of wondering about the evolutionary split, researchers were finally able to determine where these advancements had come from, along with some of the functions of these many eyes littered over the shell of the mollusk. Rasia Araldi It was believed to be a hoax until its discovery in 1818 by Sir Stamford Raffles and Dr. Joseph Arnold during a scientific expedition to a Sumatran rainforest. It's known as the largest flower to exist, measuring at 3 feet wide. Accompanying it is a nauseating stench. Scientists were able to solve the mystery of the lineage of the flower through genetic analysis. It's been a journey trying to classify the plant. It was found to be parasitic in nature by embedding itself in vines in the rainforests of Indonesia, feeding on the nutrients from other plants. It also lacks roots, leaves, and stems, as well as the photosynthesizing machinery that would give scientists just a hint as to its evolutionary tree. They also trick insects attracted to foul odors to pollinate them. Charles C. Davis from Harvard, an evolutionary biologist, agreed that the Rafflesia and species related to it have remained a mystery. He and his colleagues have done more genetic research to solve the long-standing puzzle. The flower was found to belong to the spurge family, which consists of 6,745 species and 218 flowering plants that are primarily found in the tropics. These plants live in the tissue of tropical vines related to the grapevine, with only the flower visible. They can weigh up to 15 pounds and mimic the smell of decay to attract flies for pollination. According to Davis, the lineage was found to date back 100 million years to the Cretaceous period, the last act of the dinosaurs, when flowering plants were believed to have appeared. It was further discovered that over a 46 million year span, the Rafflesia evolved a 79-fold size increase before lessening its pace. Genetic techniques to identify the plants had proved troublesome, as scientists rely on DNA from chloroplasts needed for photosynthesis, which the Rafflesia didn't have. It depended solely on its host for the nutrients it received. It took around 200 years since the discovery of the plant for the mystery of its lineage and relatives to be determined, and for the flower to finally be classified. It was further determined that the gigantism served it by attracting the flies, as it would otherwise be hidden by the dense foliage. This discovery may also have some horticulture uses if scientists are able to pinpoint a gene that's responsible for gigantism. Tidal bores occur along a coast where the river empties into an ocean. It's a strong tide that pushes upriver against the current. They're also known as a surge or a true tidal wave, where the channel suddenly becomes deeper. The Amazon River is the largest in the world. It empties into the Atlantic Ocean. The mouth of it is not narrow, but is still subjected to a rather strong tidal bore. It was named the Porra Roca and is said to not have a delta. Such events can be rather unpredictable. The cause for such a phenomenon has not always been known, but it's been discovered that another contributor to the formation of them is associated with new and full moons. When the ocean tide is at its highest, the water flows from the Atlantic rather than into it. The flow is reversed, and the distance depends on the rainwater that's been generated. A water bulge speeds upriver with great force, and a tidal bore is created with audible noise. It was further discovered that this phenomenon can be observed on biannual equinoxes in September and March during spring tide. During the spring tide, the moon and sun fall into alignment with the Earth and the gravitational poles are combined. It's due to this natural occurrence that the Porra Roca is born. The word comes from an indigenous Tupo term, porroca, which means great roar. Brazil is an epicenter for such natural events. A French oceanographer and filmmaker named Jacques Cousteau was the first to document this immense tidal bore aboard the RV Calypso, a research vessel, in 1982. His film was called Journey to 1,000 Rivers. During this time, the ocean ground swells had been breaking 9 miles out at sea from the river mouth. The ship crew had followed the 10-foot high wave that traveled at 30 miles an hour for 15 miles upstream. Additionally, this tidal bore is a surfer destination, as it's considered to be the longest surfable wave in the world, reaching 6 to 12 feet high. These rideable waves generally occur 3 days after or before a new or full moon. For quite some time, the Porra Roca was observed and remained a mystery until further research had gone into it, revealing the nature of the strange phenomenon and how it occurs. It's due to the gravitational effects of the moon and also from sun, moon, and earth alignments. Surfing such incredible waves is subject to inherent dangers. This includes uprooted swirling trees, alligators, anacondas, piranhas, and the candiru. A 100-year-old riddle came from the world of botany. A rather recent study has revealed a long-standing paleontology mystery. It solved the question as to how plants were able to transition from their aquatic environments to land through alterations in their vascular system. For years, scientists were in the process of trying to understand how these early land-dwelling plants had come to adapt to the new habitat, moving beyond the moist and boggy environments. The early plants were small and only a few centimeters tall, and were mostly found near the ponds or streams. 400 million years ago, they would go on to develop vascular systems that would allow them to gather water more efficiently and use it for the photosynthesis process. This sudden change would go on to have one of the most significant impacts on the atmosphere and ecosystems. A research team from Yale University published their findings in Science. They discovered that there was a minor change in the vascular system of the plants, making them resistant to drought, which allowed them to live in new dry areas. Professor Craig Broderson from the Yale School of the Environment had led the team. The study had come about through a century-long debate as to why the simple cylindrical vascular system of the earthland plants had changed to complex shapes. Back in the 1920s, the increasing complexity of plant fossils was noted, but the reason was not able to be determined for evolutionary alteration. For the last decade, the professor and his colleagues have been exploring the implications of how modern plant systems are constructed within the context of drought. When plants start to dry out, air bubbles start to get stuck in the xylem, which is a tissue that transports water and nutrients from the sand into the stems and leaves. The bubbles were found to block water movement. If they're left unchecked, they'll spread throughout the system, ultimately disconnecting the plant from the soil, leading to the plant shriveling up. Avoiding the formation as well as the spread of the bubbles is critical for tolerating drought today. And so the team applied this same logic to explain the patterns of the vascular organization in the plant fossil records. The vascular systems of the early plants resembled a bunch of straws, which served them well in watery habitats. As they began to move onto land, fewer resources became available, and so they had to overcome the drought-induced bubbles. They were able to do this by restructuring the cylindrical xylem into more of a complex shape that would prevent the bubbles from spreading to other areas. Previous historical observations of the vascular system, increasing in complexity, were thought to have been a mere coincidence and of very little significance. Just a byproduct of plants growing and developing. The new study, as so carried out by the team, reverses such a view. The team had explained that this sort of thing does not happen for no reason. There's a good evolutionary cause for it. There was strong pressure from drought and dryness, which caused evolutionary developments in plants. The researchers were able to solve the 100-year-old riddle and reverse the misconception. They'd made use of well-preserved fossil records, which indicated an increasing density in how the stem of plants were assembled as they began to radiate away from large water sources. The new developments would take on shapes from rings to stars and ellipses. Divergent in its form would converge in function. Back in 2016, scientists almost had to fight a crab for a strange purple orb that they'd found in a canyon just off the coast of Southern California. The EV Nautilus team had discovered a globular creature that seemed to glow under their submersible lights. One of the researchers had wondered what it was as the camera moved over the crab to where the purple blob was hanging. Another asked if they were going to grab it, but the crab was startled by the submersible, causing it to scuttle over to the mysterious critter. Unless the crab gets it first, one of them had stated. The crab had accidentally knocked the blob, but it clung in place, and soon the team would start to make some guesses as to what they were seeing. One suggested plankton, while another thought it may be an egg sac or an embryo of sorts. A suctioning device was trained at it before getting transferred into a container and making its way into the ship waiting above. Upon the EV Nautilus, a ship that was manned by the nonprofit Ocean Exploration Trust, the orb unfolded into two folds, according to a spokesperson, Susan Polton. It then revealed a foot, as well as rhinophores, which are ear-like appendages. It also revealed a proboscis upon observation. The characteristics were consistent with what one may look for in a gastropod. After some studies, the researchers believed that the 5-centimeter creature that was discovered in Argeo Canyon is likely a variant of a sea slug, a mollusk that crawls on the sea floor using a single foot. Its family includes a variety of brightly colored species that can fly, dance, and swim through all oceanic levels, the flying sea slug. The glow that was observed upon its discovery appeared to be an effect of the submersible's light, and the animal was found to not exhibit bioluminescent features. Poulton noted that the team believed that the creature was part of the plurobranch group of gastropods, instead of the more brightly colored nudibranch section, which they initially thought it to be. It also appears to be a new species, as no known species in California's deep sea plurobranchids were purple. Plurobranchids generally consume plankton or microscopic life. They also have rhinophores in particular areas, as well as a gill below the mantle on the right side. The specimen was then sent to the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology to undergo DNA analysis. Upon closer inspection, the rounded orb appeared to have more lobes, which made it look more like something from an alien sci-fi film. Upon its trip to the museum for analysis, it was determined that the newly discovered species was a velutinid, or a type of predatory snail. Most of them have an open and flattened shell and are partially enveloped in a mantle, giving it a soft tissue appearance. Most of the time when they're moving, a pair of tentacles will be revealed beneath their body, showing that they're not apistobranch sea slugs. Another characteristic is that there is an anterior siphon above their head. It took a few years for this mysterious-looking purple blob to be identified, but scientists believe they have cracked the case. It's a new species of sea snail, though a name for the creature is yet to be established, and it's uncertain if more of this creature has been found elsewhere in the world, or if researchers have more specimens for further research. Monarch butterflies can be found in North, Central, and South America, Australia, the Pacific Islands, India, and Western Europe. They're a vibrant species with bright orange wings covered in black veins, and have a black border decorated with white spots. Females have thicker veins than that of the males. The wing coloration warns predators that they're poisonous. They're found to gather their toxins from the milkweed plant, which they consume during the caterpillar stage. An animal that does not consume the butterfly will not succumb fatally to the toxin, but will generally not feel well for quite some time, and would therefore avoid eating them in the future. Hence why the butterflies mimic them. One of the most incredible things about these butterflies is the massive migration that the North American variety undertakes every year. In the fall, as the cold weather approaches, millions of them leave Canada and the United States and head toward the south. They don't stop until they've reached Southern California or central Mexico, 2,500 miles away. The travelers will return to the same forests each year, and some may even go to the same tree that their ancestors landed on. There's an estimate of 1 billion butterflies that arrive in the Mexico mountains yearly. Initially, scientists were uncertain as to how the migrating monarchs knew which way to go, since they only lived for a few months. None of them make the journey more than once. Close to the end of winter, the monarchs that have gone to Mexico and California mate. The males will then cease, and the females will head north. There, they'll deposit their eggs on milkweed plants before ceasing to exist themselves. Through extensive research, the mystery of their navigation system was finally solved. The lead researcher of the team, Professor Eli Schultzerman from the University of Washington, explained that he would like to know how the neurobiological systems are wired. He worked along with biologist colleagues, including Stephen Reppert from the University of Massachusetts. The professor wanted to record directly from the neurons present in the antennae and eyes. It was there that they were able to identify that the input cues depend entirely on the sun. One is the horizontal positioning, and the other is keeping time of day, which essentially gives the butterfly an internal sun compass that allows it to navigate southerly throughout the day. After figuring out the inputs for the compass, the professor went on to create a model system to stimulate it. This would consist of 2 control mechanisms, one of which was a timekeeping neuron in the antennae, and the other from what are known as azimuth neurons in the eyes, which are used to monitor the sun's positions. The circuit system would get these 2 signals and match them up in order to control the signals that tell the system that a correction is needed to stay on course. The professor hopes that a robotic construct of the butterfly can be made, so that they can track the migration of the monarchs and learn more about them. The same conclusion was reached by German scientists as well. Henrik Moritzen from the University of Oldenburg and his team conducted a more thorough investigation. A few of the monarchs were captured and driven 2,500 kilometers west, while others were kept in the east as a control group. Both were placed in a flight simulator in which they could fly for hours in artificial wind without going anywhere. The East monarchs aimed west, but so did the West Control Group. Morrison suggested that when they're actually performing their migration, they rely on landmarks, such as the Rocky Mountains and the Gulf of Mexico. Upon reaching one such landmark, they keep as close to the direction as their inner compass indicates. But there's one issue with this theory. If the butterflies only ever make the trip once, how do they remember the landmarks? The most prevailing answer to this mystery is that of Professor Schultzerman, who found that they rely on the sun positioning, which feeds the signals in their eyes and antennae, which connect the circuit directing them to where they need to go. The green flash refers to a rare and mysterious meteorological phenomenon that occurs at sunrise or sunset. Rarely, as the sun slowly sinks low on a clear horizon, a vibrant green flash can be observed before darkness seeps in. Mariners would see this observation as a sign of luck, or more eerily, evidence of a soul returning. Behind such legends, the green flash is an actual documented optical occurrence that's very much real, though it is elusive. Since it's occurred so rarely, it's been difficult to study, but researchers believe they have solved it. It was discovered that the green flashes are made due to the Earth's atmosphere, which causes the sun's light to separate and disperse into different colors. They can be observed from any altitude and are often seen at an unobstructed horizon. The moon and bright planets such as Venus and Jupiter may be associated with the observation of this occurrence. If the atmosphere is layered, the flash may appear as a series of different ones. It was found that they occur due to refraction. Colors of light bend at different amounts based on the wavelengths. Shorter wavelengths, such as violet, green, and blue, refract stronger than that of longer ones, such as yellow, red, and orange. Blue and violet are scattered by the atmosphere, while reds and oranges are absorbed by it, which leaves the green light the most visible color, for just a matter of seconds, with the sun sets below a certain point or rises above it. These flashes are also enhanced by mirages, increasing refraction. Occasionally, when the air is significantly cleared, if enough blue or violet makes it through the atmosphere, it'll create a blue strike instead of a green one. There are also found to be 4 categories of green flash, including inferior mirage, mock mirage, subduct flash, and green ray. Generally, the sightings of the flash occur in the first 2 categories. In the first one, the flashes are oval-shaped and flat, and would happen close to sea level when the water surface is warmer than the air above. Mock mirages can be seen a bit higher up when surface conditions are colder than the air. The flashes in this case are pointy and thin, as if they're being sliced from the sun, and last up to 2 seconds. Subduct flashes are formed when the sun forms an hourglass shape due to atmospheric inversion, another phenomenon that comes about when a layer of warm air traps colder air and moisture closer to the ground. In such an uncommon circumstance, the upper section of the sun may look green for 15 seconds. The green ray is the rarest and appears as a beam of light emitting straight up immediately after the sun is set for no more than a second. This is caused by a combination of hazy air and an unusually bright inferior, mock or subduct flash. To see such an incredible, now-solved phenomenon, one would have to wait for the view of the horizon to be unobstructed. These events generally occur above the ocean, which is why they're often sighted on boats. They're an extremely rare sight and are notorious for their unpredictability. Fermat's last theorem refers to a statement that there are no natural numbers such that x to the power of n plus y to the power of n equals z to the power of n, in which the n is a natural number that's higher than 2. An example explains that if n equals 3, Fermat's last theorem suggests that no natural numbers x, y, z exist, that x to the power of 3 plus y to the power of 3 equals z to the power of 3. The sum of 2 cubes cannot equal a cube. Pierre de Fermat, a French mathematician, wrote the following: "It's impossible for a cube to be the sum of 2 cubes." He furthered this statement by stating that it's also impossible for a 4th power to be the sum of 2 4th powers. "I've discovered a truly remarkable proof, but this margin is too small to contain it," he wrote. For centuries, this statement would go on to baffle mathematicians, as no one was able to prove or disprove Fermat's last theorem. But proofs for specific values of n were devised. Fermat, for example, did a proof for a different theorem that solved the case of n equals 4 using infinite descent. and by 1993, with the aid of computers, it had been confirmed that all prime numbers n are less than 4 million. It was by this time that mathematicians had found that proving a case of a result from algebraic geometry, as well as number theory, known as Shimura-Taniyama-Weyl conjecture, would be the equivalent of proving the baffling theorem. Finally, an English mathematician named Andrew Wiles, who'd been interested in Fermat's last theorem since the age of 10, had given proof of the conjecture in 1993. But an error would be found in this proof, but Wiles was then aided by a former student, Richard Taylor, so he was able to devise a proof for the theorem, and it was published in 1995. The fact that so many centuries had passed since the discovery of the annotations written in the margin without proof led mathematicians to suspect that Fermat was mistaken in believing that he had proof. The theorem of which Wiles had proved was much deeper and more mathematically interesting than Fermat's last theorem, which demonstrated that in various cases, the value of a problem is best measured by the depth and breadth of the tools that are made to solve it. 19th century attempts to solve the theorem proved unsuccessful, but had been the instrument of creating the field of algebraic number theory. It's believed by some mathematicians that the proof that Fermat spoke of was similar to the erroneous proof that had been produced in the 19th century. It was on the 23rd of June, 1993, that Wiles gave the last of 3 lectures that detailed his solution to Fermat's last theorem, a problem that remained unsolved for over 3 centuries. Aside from providing a solution to an old problem, Wiles's work marked an important moment in establishing a bridge between 2 important but different areas of mathematics. Fermat's last theorem is similar to the Pythagorean theorem, stating that the sides of a right triangle give the solution to x to the power of 2 plus y to the power of 2 equals z to the power of 2. Every varying sized triangle would give a different solution, and there are many solutions where all 3 x, y, and z are whole numbers, with the smallest example being x equals 3, y equals 4, and z equals 5. The theorem is about what happens if that exponent changes to a value greater than 2. The question was if there are whole number solutions to x to the power of 3 plus y to the power of 3 equals z to the power of 3. Fermat had the answer, but it was no. There are no 3 positive whole numbers that are a solution to x to the power of n plus y to the power of n and z to the power of n for any power to be greater than 2. For over 350 years, no one could find the missing proof for this, and it gained its spot in the Guinness World Records as the most difficult math problem, the proof of which Andrew Wiles had found spanned over 150 pages. In order to make use of this, one need only remember that if an equation that's formed as a to the power of n plus b to the power of n equals c to the power of n, and these exponents are greater than 2, one can say that the equation is actually false, based on the proof of Fermat's last theorem. Bioluminescence refers to the production and emission of light by an organism. Creatures with this ability can be found from the ocean surface to the deep sea. It's been observed in bacteria, jellyfish, algae, worms, sea stars, fish, crustaceans, and surprisingly, sharks. There are around 1,500 known species of fish that have luminescence. The light emission is used for a variety of things, from attracting a mate to camouflage. Strangely, some shark species have been found with this adaptation in the deep sea. There had already been a few sharks that were discovered with this adaptation, but none were quite as large as the kitefin shark, that reaches almost 6 feet long. A study back in 2020 allowed the examination of 3 bioluminescent shark species. The kitefin shark, the black belly lantern shark, and the southern lantern shark were found to be the largest bioluminescent organisms known. The glowing sharks were described in the 19th century, and around 10% of sharks are capable of producing light. The 3 observed species live in what's referred to as the ocean's twilight zone. This zone is a depth of between 200 and 1,000 meters below sea level, and lies beyond where solar light can reach. While the existence of the kitefin shark has been known for some time, they were seen glowing for the first time ever by scientists in January of 2020. A biologist, Jerome Malafet, expressed that this had been one of his holy grails to have seen a glowing shark. The biologist had been searching for the glowing sharks on the Chatham Rise off the coast of the South Island, New Zealand. While researchers aboard the ship Tangaroa hauled up nets for hoki for the annual fisheries survey, Malafit kept his eyes open for bycatch. The team had collected over 600 deep-sea sharks of the 3 different species. 24 of them were placed into tanks in the wet lab as the ships that rolled these sharks were photographed in the darkness. All 3 sharks were found to have the ability to glow. It was during this examination that the kite fin shark was found to measure 1.8 meters in length, making it the largest light-producing organism with a spine that was ever discovered. Studies from the 1980s had suggested that these creatures had light-emitting organs present in their skin, but no one had seen one alive and glowing. The smaller glowing deep-sea sharks would use their bioluminescence for survival or for communication with others. Some of them even had spines along their back that looked like lightsabers in the darkness, which warned intruders or predators to leave them alone. Some males would also light up their claspers, which is presumed to have been to attract a mate. Other sharks would use this adaptation as camouflage to blend in with the darkness and appear invisible to predators and prey by hiding their silhouette. But the kite fin shark is much too big to have had this adaptation for predator evasion. Rather, it was found that they used the underside glow to illuminate the sea floor while hunting for prey, while also allowing them to sneak up without being seen. This would explain why faster swimming sharks had been found within the stomach of the kite fins. Since they're the slowest swimmers, they rely on stealth and camouflage. It was also explained that in the twilight zone, there's a rather faint blue light that emits from the surface, and when seen from beneath, the sharks would look like silhouettes. To counter this, the light production blends with the bluish tint from above, giving off the effect of invisibility. While the adoption of bioluminescence is still considered to be a phenomenon, it was found that these glowing sharks produce light through small cup structures known as photophores that are dotted all over their skin. In the middle of each of these cups are the light-emitting cells, along with a lens that directs the light outwards. What's even more strange is that the light is controlled by hormones. What helps us sleep makes the sharks glow. It had been Malafit and his colleagues who discovered that the bioluminescence was being controlled hormonally. They determined that melatonin was responsible for the activation and regulation of bioluminescence. The lights-off switch is believed to have been controlled by a separate hormonal pathway. In another study, this time conducted by Mizuno and his colleagues, they found that sharks use 2 to 3 hormones at least to both trigger as well as slow down light emission. The process was found to be slow, and the sharks can glow for around an hour or 2, but once they're lit up, they cannot rapidly change. But not all of the questions about this adaptation could be answered. One aspect of the bioluminescence found in sharks remains enigmatic: the question as to how the light is produced. Most animals that glow house symbiotic bacteria within their bodies that act as luminous partners, but these bacteria were not found in sharks. Other organisms produce chemicals that carry out reactions that cause light. This is also proving difficult to track down in the glowing sharks. It was not just bioluminescent sharks that were discovered. At around 1,000 to 2,000 feet down in the depths of the ocean, we find the home of the swell shark and the chain cat shark. When looking at them with our human eyes, they may appear as just an ordinary gray, beige, or brown patterned creature. But with the use of a blue filter, beaming fluorescent green glows enhance the beauty of these organisms. This was another recent discovery that brought us to understand more about the shark world and how they interact with their surroundings. Sharks are mostly colorblind, which led to questions as to how they attract mates, warn off predators, and sneak up on prey. These recent discoveries found that their eyes can detect only the blue-green spectrum, meaning that when the sharks change color in the blue waters, they're projecting a secret code to the others. One pattern represents the male, while the other represents the female. The mystery here was how exactly they could take blue light from their dull surroundings and transform it into the brightest neon sign. Science was able to solve this mystery as well. In a study that was published in iScience, it was revealed that molecules within the shark's scales transform how the skin interacts with light. These molecules bring in blue photons while sending out green ones. This discovery improved the understanding of these sharks and their luminous illusions. Such scientific solutions will aid in the improvement of imaging, as previous biofluorescent studies in other marine life had. This is a widespread phenomenon among at least 200 marine animals. Shark skin is plated with tooth-like scales that are called denticles. In order to uncover the biofluorescent secrets, David Gruber, marine biologist at the City University of New York, worked with Jason Crawford, a biochemist at Yale University. Crawford aided in determining what metabolic pathways of chemical reactions inside the cells could explain the neon shark skin of both the swell and the cat shark. While under the microscope, the researchers found several types of dendrites that emitted a green flow of different intensities in response to the blue light. Some of the dendrites would focus the light and channel it outward, much like a fiber optic display. Upon closer examination, a set of molecules was found deriving from tryptophan, which is an amino acid that's crucial in the sleep and mood of humans. They also contain bromine, which changes how these molecules in the skin interact with light. Many fluorescent marine creatures have evolved their own unique ways of transforming light. One of the most well-studied among these is the use of the green fluorescent protein, which turns jellyfish into rainbows, along with corals and other organisms in the shallower depths. But the process of which these sharks used was unlike these. The molecule metabolites in the skin may have stuck around as they aid the sharks in recognizing a mate in the dark ocean. Some have also been found to have antibiotic properties which allow the shark skin to stay relatively clean, even though they encounter a variety of bacteria on the seafloor. While the questions as to how and why the bioluminescent and biofluorescent sharks produce these glowing emissions were answered, some questions remain. One of them being, why do these sharks have these adaptations when similar species do not? Perhaps it just hasn't been discovered yet that these other species do in fact emit light in a specific way. They can only be seen under a different kind of light. The Enchanted Rock refers to a large pink granite batholith found in Fredericksburg, Texas, consisting of granite hills including Little Mountain, Turkey Peak, Freshman Mountain, Buzzard's Roost, and Flagpole Mountain. A batholith refers to an igneous rock formation that occurs when molten magma intrudes into the Earth's crust and melts the bedrock before cooling underground. Sharon Mosher, the chair of geology at the University of Texas, explained that it's common that when continents collide, the crust becomes too thick and can no longer support its own weight. For a few 100 million years, periods of erosion had alternated with periods of deposition. 100 million years ago, a sea overran central Texas and deposited limestone that had formed the hill country. 65 million years ago, uplift had exposed this limestone to erosion, and unlike limestone, metamorphic rock such as granite is resistant to weathering and erosion. And so the stone that covered Enchanted Rock had weathered away and exposed the pink-colored granite beneath it. Enchanted Rock and Little Mountain show broken sheets and smooth slopes of the dome. Turkey Peak and Buzzard's Roost have single east-dipping granite sheets that make sharp peaks. Freshman Mountain has a thick coat of weather granite along with gravel on the west side, which perhaps is a residue of the past humid conditions. It's been attributed to spiritual powers, ghosts, and more by the Tonkawa Native Americans. It's a pluton or igneous rock intrusion that's shaped like a dome, formed from pink granite that rises 425 feet out of the ground. This monolith has been part of human history for at least the last 11,000 years and covers around 640 acres. The formation story began 11 billion years ago when two continents collided and formed a mountain range that at one point reached Canada. Its name derived from an interpretation of Native American legends by the Spanish and Anglo settlers. The legends surrounding this rock structure are plentiful, and some predating the arrival of the Europeans, and others which include conquistadors and Anglo-Texans. While it appeared that science had an explanation for exactly what caused this phenomenon, the legends say otherwise. One legend of the Tonkawa tradition tells the story of the last of their tribe, brave warriors who fought atop the rock and defended themselves from an invading group. Another legend speaks of a princess who watched as her tribe was overcome. The legend states that the princess's spirit, as well as those of the warriors, still haunt the granite monadnock. Also, according to the Tonkawa stories, there have been phantom campfires seen on top of the dome during the night. What fueled these myths and stories was the fact that during the night or early morning, the Enchanted Rock made some audible sounds, leaving these tribes to believe that they were the moans and groans of ghostly entities. It's also been said that the batholith sparkles during the evening, likely during damp nights that are well lit with moonlight. Another story explains that a Native American chief was so overcome with guilt that his spirit remained there, and the small rock pools are the footprints of his ghost that walk the rock to this day. The Enchanted Rock, as the name suggests, saw an increase in magical attributes throughout the years. An incredible feature of this rock is the vernal pools, or the footsteps of the chief spirit, which house marine animals such as small shrimp. The pools also have bogs surrounding them with tiny quillwort species or vascular spore-bearing plants that are found nowhere else in the world. The screams that can be heard at night are said to be from the spirit of a woman who escaped her captors and found safety among the rocks and crevices like many others before her. While she'd been able to escape, she was incapable of avoiding loneliness and solitude, and her cries wore on into the night. According to a different story in 1750, a young Spanish soldier who was called Don Jesus Navarro had fallen in love with Chief Tijuana's daughter, who was named Rosa. But this was not very well received by other Native American tribes, and she was kidnapped and taken to Enchanted Rock. Their plan was that they would sacrifice her to the spirits, but Navarro had loved her so much that he pursued the kidnappers. Before the tribes could carry out their nefarious plan, the Spanish soldiers swooped in and saved Rosa. This mysterious rock was also found to contain a 1,500-foot-long grave, which is one of the longest granite caves in the world. It's also free for anyone to explore, despite being cold, wet, and full of spiders. Artifacts dating back at least 11,000 years have been uncovered here. Here, one can also find spring water, pecans, Texas persimmons, mesquite, prickly pear, and medicinal herbs. In addition to all of this, there's also a rare semi-precious stone that's found in the area known as lanite, but it's illegal to remove such rocks from the park. The mystery comes in with the aforementioned moans and groans that can be heard emitting from the batholith. While it's been said that the sounds are the cries of the souls that linger there, a more scientific explanation was required, and it had been a strange mystery for decades. Scientists have found that the reason the intrusion makes ghostly sounds is due to nothing more than temperature fluctuations. The sounds can mostly be heard during the evening when it's cooler. The moans and creaks are being caused by the expansion and contraction of the thick sheets of granite that move against one another. Katie Armstrong Nelson wrote a piece on the natural and legendary history of Enchanted Rock. At the start of her explanation, she states that there was a flash before sudden darkness taking place at the intrusion. She initially thought that she couldn't have seen something like this, but it appeared again. She'd seen a bright light hovering in the bush. If she'd been in a different area, Katie would have thought that the light was coming from a torch or an animal's reflective light. But she'd been halfway up Enchanted Rock at night with her 16-year-old brother. Katie detailed that formation is awe-inspiring during the day, and that it looks almost alien in the hill country, and appears as though the landscape is giving birth to Mars. Charles Moss had written in his 1956 pamphlet, Facts and Fiction about the Enchanted Rock, that the name traces back to the unwritten chapters of both Native American as well as Spanish history, and tells the story of Aboriginal rites, ceremonies, wars, love, and treasure seekers, all of which are interconnected with the rock. Katie furthered that the rock beckons visitors to its summit to enjoy an incredible view, only to be taken aback by the daunting descent. While the screams and moans and creaks were finally solved by scientists and researchers, some questions still remain. At night, rock fires and ghost lamps light up the formation, which are being accredited to the reflections of moonlight bouncing off the crystals in the granite, or even the duvet that covers it in the early morning. Enchanted Rock was found to be shorter than that of Georgia's Stone Mountain, but larger than Wyoming's Independence Rock. It's so large that even underneath its shadow, visitors and hikers misjudge its proportions and begin a breakfast appetizer climb, which consumes a large portion of the morning. For the last 10,000 years, the dome had been left unchanged. It's considered to be a giant archaeological site, while the Enchanted Rock State Natural Area holds around 98 other sites. Within this area, spear tips, pottery, and middens had pointed to 12,000 years of habitation of the area. And during the 18th century, the Tonkawa had controlled the region before the Apache had taken over. The Apache would then be displaced by the Comanche before the German colonists established Fredericksburg. Luckily, at least one mystery surrounding the supposed Enchanted Rock has been solved. The screams, moans, and creaks were nothing more than the natural occurrence of temperature fluctuations, expansion, and contraction. Fire has become a normal part of our everyday lives, and not much thought has been given to it. It warms us and delights us, but can also be terrifying. It's one of the most important elements of the world. It was according to Greek legends that Prometheus had stolen fire from the gods and given it to humans. Native Americans speak of an animal that had taken the element from an evil being. The Caroline Islands tell the story of a boy called Olafat, who gave the fire to people by allowing a bird to fly from the heavens with it in its beak. There have been various scientific theories as to when humans were first able to control fire, but fire did not need to be invented, as it already existed before the first humans. Creatures that predated the first people were well aware of the element's existence through events such as volcanic eruption or lightning strikes that set a forest ablaze. It's theorized that the first humans may have also bore witness to this and sought to recreate it in a more controlled way. Evolutionists suggest that these primitive people learned to make fire using flint and sticks. It's now believed by scientists that the first humans who were able to control and use fire had been the Homo erectus during the early Stone Age. There was evidence uncovered suggesting the controlled use of the element within the Wonderwork Cave in southern Africa and near Lake Turkana in the Kenyan region. While the question as to perhaps who the first humans were to create and control fire was answered, mysteries still remained. How did the fire stay alive? Why does it burn? Scientists were able to determine that the colorful flame of the element is the result of a chemical reaction that's known as combustion. During the process of combustion, atoms irreversibly rearrange themselves. While it was initially found that friction, heat, and fuel played a role in the creation of fire, it was not until some time later that oxygen was added to the list of ingredients. Lacking just one of these ingredients would cause the fire to cease to burn. On planets that contain less oxygen, flames may find it difficult to thrive or even start in the first place. Wood contains molecules that are made of bound atoms of carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, making it the perfect fuel for a fire. When wood becomes hot enough, such as when a tree is struck by lightning, the bonds of atoms break and a process known as pyrolysis releases these atoms and energy. The unbound atoms will form a hot gas that mingles with the oxygen atoms in the air, producing a blue light at the base of the flame. It's widely believed that the blue hue is caused by fuel, but it was found that the color comes from the reaction that unbound atoms may have with oxygen. But these atoms do not stay singular for long, and they bind with the oxygen in a process known as oxidation. When carbon and oxygen bond, carbon dioxide is formed, and when hydrogen and oxygen bond, water vapor is the result. Fires only burn when the atomic shuffling gives off enough energy in order to keep the oxidation process going in a sustained chain reaction. More atoms that get released from the burning fuel combine with oxygen, releasing more energy in more atoms. The orange and yellow tones in the flames are caused when extra carbon atoms that are free-floating get hot and start to glow. It's the carbon atoms that make the thick black soot that's formed on burgers or on the bottom of a pot. It had been Antoine Lavoisier who determined that combustion was caused by the chemical reaction with what he had named oxygen. The oxygen theory of combustion had been the result of a demanding and sustained campaign to create an experimentally grounded chemical theory on combustion, respiration, and calcination. The emerging theory was a mirror image of phlogiston theory, but gaining evidence of this new theory involved more than just demonstrating the errors and inadequacies of the previous one. The phlogiston theory suggested the existence of a fire element called phlogiston, which was contained in combustible bodies and was released upon combustion. From the early 1770s up until 1785, when the last crucial pieces of the theory had fallen into place, Lavoisier, along with his collaborators, had performed a variety of experiments that were designed to advance certain points of their research frontier. In the early 1770s, Lavoisier's research centered around weight gains and losses in calcination. During this research, he would encounter some related phenomenon which needed explanations. For instance, mineral acids were created by roasting a mineral like sulfur in a fire and mixing the resultant calx with water. He initially conjectured that sulfur combined with air in the fire, and that the air had been the cause of the acidity. It was not obvious, though, just what type of air had made the sulfur acidic. The problem was complicated even further by the discovery of new kinds of air. Joseph Priestley would lead these discoveries, and despite his adherence to the phlogiston theory, he'd aided Lavoisier in unraveling the mystery of oxygen. Lavoisier and his team were experimenting with some reactions that were the same as what Priestley had been studying, but they'd failed to notice the novel properties of the air. Later that same year, in honor of the Academy of Science, Priestley held a dinner in which he informed his French colleagues of the properties of the air. This caused Lavoisier to head back to the lab and repeat the experiment. It was thereafter that he'd found the air that he needed to complete his theory, and named it oxygen. By isolating oxygen, he was able to explain both quantitative and qualitative changes that had occurred in calcination, respiration, and combustion. And so the mystery was solved. Fire did not just need fuel and heat to thrive, it required oxygen as well. The Colossi of Memnon refers to two immense statues of the 18th dynasty pharaoh Amenhotep III. These two megaliths were designed to guard the pharaoh's mortuary temple that was located on the west bank of the Nile, opposite Luxor in Egypt. The faceless colossi are the first thing that any visitor will see when they reach the area of the West Bank, which is not surprising based on their dimensions, which are 60 feet tall and weigh somewhere around 720 tons each. The builds were formed from sandstone that came from the Cairo quarries. It's believed that the sandstone was transported 420 miles south of Thebes, over land because they were too heavy to have been carried on the Nile. The Colossi of Memnon had been completed around 1350 BC. They were already a tourist attraction by the time of the Greco-Roman era, thousands of years later. The legend states that at sunrise, the northern statue would begin to whistle, and would continue for several minutes as stated in the translated hieroglyphics, which was initially believed to have been due to a crack in its body as a result of an earthquake. The ruler, Pharaoh Amenhotep, and his wife were portrayed in the statues as seated figures with their hands resting on their knees. They're both looking east towards the Nile. Every pharaoh relating to the New Kingdom would have some sort of sacred monument built in their honor while they were still living in order to affirm their divine nature. The giants of Memnon were situated at the entrance of the temple, which is a size of 35 hectares and believed to be the largest and wealthiest in Egypt. So much so that no other pharaoh, such as Ramses II or III, could match its majesty. The sound that the Colossi of Memnon would make was described as a haunting whistle, a melody, the strumming of a harp string, or another haunting sound. The statues were attributed to the African king Memnon, and the ancient Greeks and Romans considered the song to be good luck, and believed that the song was the cry of the king greeting Eos, the god of dawn. Greek legend spoke of Memnon, a mortal whose mother was the goddess of dawn, who lamented her son's passing by shedding tears each morning. The statues were given this name due to the high-pitched sound that would emit at dawn. They believed that the sound was Eos crying out for her son or mourning him. The Romans had referred to the Colossi of Memnon as the vocal Memnon. It was also thought that the statues and their singing was an oracle, and soon they grew in popularity for this reason. People would come to visit the crumbling giants to ask a question and try to decipher an answer with the prophetic whistles. But the questions remained. Why and how did the statues sing? For decades, many have wondered where the singing was actually coming from. They needed a scientific explanation that was not tied to myths and legends or gods and goddesses. Luckily, this is precisely what they got when researchers and scientists cracked the case. It was stated that the explanations for the sound would either be human-related or something to do with nature. Strabo, a Greek historian, geographer, and philosopher, was unable to determine where exactly the sound had been emanating from: the plinth, the broken top, or the base. It would later be determined by scientists that nature and physics were at play here, and had been causing the singing sound that traveled across the desert. It was found that early morning dew would collect on the porous rocks and become trapped in the crack of the statue, and when the sun rose, the dew would begin to evaporate. It was due to the evaporation that acoustic vibrations would resound in the air of the desert, creating a whistling or high-pitched sound. Evidence that was in favor of this explanation was the fact that this monument had ceased its whistles in 199 AD, after Emperor Septimius Severus had repaired it in an attempt to win the favor of the gods. The crack in the northern statue that had been caused by an earthquake was filled in, and the dew stopped collecting within it, ultimately putting a stop to the song or the cries of Eos. While this explanation had been accepted as the most accurate one, there is another one that suggests something slightly different. It's thought that the sounds are the result of the expansion and contraction of the stone while it's being warmed in the morning sun. This natural acoustic phenomenon, together with the size of the statues as well as their structure, have created an eerie noise that has echoed through the years. Similar sounds have been reported as occurring in other Egyptian monuments. A complex of temples located just short of Luxor, called Karnak, was a place where many of those sounds would be documented. The sounds were found to come from the monuments within the complex. The colossi of Memnon have withstood the test of time as well as survived the ravages of history. The two monuments bear marks from the past and stand as a symbol of resilience in both their physical condition as well as their ability to grab the imaginations of anyone who encounters them. The monuments remain an important tourist attraction in Egypt, as visitors gather around to marvel at the grandeur of the ancient megaliths and to witness the sunrise in hopes of catching the singing statues in action. At one point, there had been in circulation a series of Polaroid photographs that seemed to capture the auras of the subject, but no one quite understood how this may have worked. It was believed and claimed that these images were capturing the wispy colors of the subject's aura. It was stated that this type of photography is a powerful way of finding out what energy you radiate, and the images capture what you're not able to see with the naked eye. It's also referred to as the human atmosphere, as stated by Aileen Lee. A few years ago, the practice became a sensation, as it would reveal a visual representation of how a person feels. Aura photography was initially invented in the 1970s by Guy Coggins, after he'd created a camera that captured the individual energy fields that each person puts out into the world. The cameras that are used look like a box, which has two smaller boxes the subject places their hands on for the photo. The two boxes are metal and have been laced with silver that allows for a biometric feedback system to create these magnificent colors. It's further explained that the hand plates can sense the vibrational frequency of the individual through meridian points in one's hands. This information is then sent to the camera, which is then matched with the corresponding color through the camera's internal algorithm. After the image is taken, much like a Polaroid, the photo gets printed and the photographer interprets the colors for the subject. The picture is able to describe certain details about a person based on the energy that had produced the colors. There are 7 main colors present in the camera that can merge to form new colors. The colors are red, which is associated with the root chakra. It represents fearlessness, materialism, anger, passion, or exhaustion. Orange is associated with the sacral chakra and is a representation of joy, action, and friendliness. Yellow is connected with the solar plexus chakra for confidence, self-esteem, leadership, intelligence, and happiness. A green hue that's linked with the heart chakra is said to represent growth, balance, peace, and healing, whereas blue, the throat chakra, is intuition, protection, and sensitivity. Indigo is the color of the third eye, revealing intuition, spirituality, curiosity, and self-doubt. Violet, the crown chakra, shows vision, leadership, wisdom, innovation, and philanthropy. Aura photography is accomplished when the electricity hits the subject and ionizes the air around them. This air also contains water, most likely sweat, which produces various different colors. Once this is produced, photographers or psychics add a meaning to each of these colors, even though it's not scientifically proven that any of these colors represent a certain aspect of a person. This luminescence is caused by air molecules and atoms that selectively absorb solar ultraviolet and X radiation. Radiation that's emitted from the molecules and the atoms is observed in the visible area of the electromagnetic spectrum. It was found that the wavelength of sodium emissions is around 590 nanometers, and so they could appear to be a yellow-orange color. Wavelength emissions from OH and molecular oxygen range from 650 to 700 nanometers, which produce a red color, whereas 380 to 490 nanometers would give off a violet to blue color. Atomic oxygen emissions are found to occur at 3 wavelengths, at 508 nanometers producing the color green, 629, which is orange-red, and 632, which is red within the electromagnetic spectrum. There's a similar type of photography that's occasionally referred to as aura photography, but is correctly known as Kirlian photography. But it uses a similar effect involving electricity. Some have asked if Kirlian images show the souls of organisms, but they don't. Kirlian pictures are actually showing the light that's being emitted by electrified air that surrounds an object when it's been purposefully filled with electricity. Pseudoscientists have claimed that the patterns of emitted light that are captured in Kirlian images are that of an organism's soul, aura, or metaphysical field. But the truth is that when an electric charge moves quickly through the air, it rips electrons off the air molecules while giving them energy. When the electrons re-merge with the molecules, they give off an energy that takes the form of light. For a low to medium amount of electricity, the process becomes known as gas discharge. This exact process is also present in neon signs and fluorescent lights. For higher amounts of electricity, the process becomes more violent, and it's referred to as arcing, which includes sparks like from a spark plug or a welder. When an object or a subject sits in open air and it's filled with enough electric charge, the charge then leaks off of it and into the air that surrounds it. The air then becomes electrified and produces a flow of different colors, such as within aura photography. Furthermore, since the air that's closer to the subject is the most electrified, the pattern of light takes the shape of it, which is why the glow or aura surrounding the person seems to imitate their body shape. While this process may sound exotic and look mystical and strange, it's a rather simple explanation. For inanimate objects, this effect is known as the corona discharge, which can affect nails, pennies, and various other items, but it doesn't indicate that they have a living soul as pseudoscientists may suggest. Kirlian photography had been invented in 1939 by Simeon Kirlian, a Russian inventor, and his wife, Valentina. The two were said to have observed a patient in the hospital who'd been receiving treatment through an electrical generator. The electrodes had been placed near the patient's skin, which had suddenly allowed for a neon glow. This inspired the couple to capture this same glow on camera. During an experiment, a hand from a subject was placed on an electrified photographic plate, which would result in an electrographic image that had outlined the palm of the hand. It appeared vibrant and pulsed with energy. This is how Kirlian photography was born, and later aura photography, both of which had a similar process. The difference between the two types of photography is that Kirlian photography shows sharper electricity-like edges, whereas the aura photography appears softer and more vague. The aura that surrounds the subject scientifically has no connotation with human feelings or souls, but is rather an electrical process that results in a variety of colors that shape around the subject. The art of this photography is still fairly interesting, and many have given all kinds of meaning to what the colors would represent. Real-life magnetic man sets world record for most spoons attached to his body. This is the title that Edibar Elchev was awarded after he was able to hold 43 spoons on his chest and back. On this day, he had beat his personal best by 3. It was in 2013 when the man had set the new world record for human magnetism. The then 41-year-old had been a kickboxing coach in Georgia during this time. When the time comes, I'm going to be able to move airplanes and empty train carriages, is what Edibar had claimed. The record holder stresses that he's able to stick a spoon to his body due to the fact that he has supposed natural magnetic properties. But this hasn't gotten everyone convinced. Some state that the spoons would stick to his body because he's hairless and his skin is smooth. Edibar was not the only magnetic man around. Lu Thao Lin, who's from Malaysia, was known as the Magnetic Man, or Mr. Magnet, because of his strange ability to stick metal items to his person. He had performed this power at charity events. It was found that he's able to have metal objects that weigh anywhere from 2 to 36 kilograms in total, magnetically stuck to him. It was alleged that he was able to pull this car using this strange ability. However, Lu's superpower has nothing to do with magnetism whatsoever. Scientists from Malaysia's University of Technology researched this phenomenon but found no magnetic field in the Magnet Man's body. What they'd been able to determine, however, was that his skin had exhibited high levels of friction that had provided some sort of suction effect. It was found that this trait had been genetic and was also found in his 3 grandchildren. Another magnetic superhuman was Ao Raelianu, who's said to have been able to stick a 50-pound television set to his chest without the use of glue, wires, or string. Ao has since become known as a human magnet. He's kept his mysterious magnetic trait a secret for quite some time. He's said to live in Bucharest and is journeying on a career path to use his power for more than just entertainment. The 40-year-old individual was working as a chitotherapist who used the healing qualities of his traits to assist people after they'd been involved in accidents. In addition to the TV set, Ao was able to stick a piece of wood with nails hammered into them to his person as well. He further expressed that he prefers to keep it a secret in his hometown to avoid being labeled as a freak. The human magnet is not entirely sure how his power might work, but he believes it's been there since he was a child. It's not been until 2001 that he realized that objects would stay connected to his body, even if they hadn't been glued or otherwise physically attached to him. One day, Ao had found that the clasp on his heavy necklace had broken, and as he looked in the mirror, he noted that although the clasp was broken, the necklace was still stuck to his neck. He would then go on to stick more items to himself, but noted that it would only work on bare skin. Ao had even stated that when visiting the doctor, the stethoscope would also become stuck to his chest. There may be a simple explanation for these few mysteries of human magnetism. Scientists believe that it's not magnetism at all, but rather the work of friction and unusually sticky skin. Additionally, those who claim to be able to stick metal items to their person have also been able to attract other materials, including glass and wood, suggesting that it's definitely not magnetism, as this would only work with metals. These researchers have also further noted that the human magnets only stick items to their skin and never to clothing, supporting this theory. Magnetism would not be blocked by a simple piece of fabric, and it should be unnecessary for the individuals to undress. The internet had been set alight with videos and images of these human magnets that had coins and cell phones stuck to them. Another case had been that of Leonid Tenkayev and his wife, who had claimed that a nuclear incident had given them the power of magnetism. While the human body is able to generate some magnetic field, it's rather small and a weak one, far too weak to attract any metals. Miroslav Magola is one of the more famous magnets who's lived in Germany and travels the world in search of universal truths. In 1992, he was thought to have found an ability that counters the law of nature. Magola had shown how a meat cleaver would stick to his chest on the flat side. Wherein lies the clue. These items that have been alleged to stick to the bodies of these individuals have always had a smooth surface. For example, if one was to cut a potato using a wide sharpened blade, it may appear to be a challenge to unstick it from the potato. Smooth surfaces that are brought together will certainly stick, even more so if they're separated by a thin liquid, much like sweat. Pressing a smooth item to greasy skin will create a suction effect, which will occur especially if the person were to tilt backward. Some of these superhumans also produce more sticky sweat, and no one is made entirely the same. There's also a condition that's known as acquired cutaneous adhesion syndrome, which can occur due to certain medications, such as retinoids, proton pump inhibitors, and antifungals. In addition to this, the magnetic humans are almost always hairless, and if they did have hair, then the act of magnetism wouldn't occur. Magola has claimed to have debunked this, but applied talcum powder to his hands and circulated the video online as proof. but it's noted that he does wipe off a lot of the powder and proceeds to pick up an upside-down bowl. It's questioned as to how or why these human magnets can only attract smooth-shaped objects, and not oddly shaped ones, such as a ball. It was found that in addition to sticky sweat and smooth skin, natural oils had also played a part in the magnetism. And so the strange mystery had been solved by skeptics in basic sciences. Human magnetism had actually occurred through genetics, medications, or external matters. It's also noted that Edibar Elchiev had been a kickboxer and is assumed to have sweated more due to this, and it would allow a thin layer of grease to cover his body, resulting in a superhuman-like magnetism. There are some rather strange and crazy events that take place in Joshua chapter 10 of the Bible. One such event had occurred when the king wanted to attack an Israeli ally, which had caused Joshua to become concerned. At this point, God is said to have destroyed the king's army, and as the defeated group ran off, Joshua had called out to the Lord in the presence of Israel the following, saying, quote, "O sun, stand still at Gibeon, and O moon, in the valley of Ajalon." The sun did stand still, and the moon had stopped until the nation was able to avenge itself. It's in the 10th chapter of the book of Joshua that this account has been recorded in full, reading, quote, "Then Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered upon the Amorites, before the children of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, Sun, stand over Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still and the moon stopped, till the people had revenge upon their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Jasher? So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven, and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. And there had been no day like that, before it or after it, and the Lord heeded the voice of a man, for the Lord fought Israel." It's been this line that has somewhat confused those who read or have read the Bible. In the text, it's written that the sun stopped, and in the Hebrew language it does use two words which have the idea to stop. The two words are daman and amad. The word, however, that's been translated to mean stand still, dam, actually means to be silent and have the sense to cease or leave off. The word amad has the sense of cease. The fact that Joshua had asked or told the sun to stop is not what the issue is, but rather in which sense he had done this. He had given the command for the sun to stand still, and there have been a few different ways in which readers have understood what occurred in this passage. Some believe that the passage is purely poetic. Some scholars view the account as a poetical description of the battle, and not something to be taken literally. Others theorize that the passage refers to the eclipse of the sun. An Old Testament scholar, Robert Dick Wilson, is the one who had translated the passage to read, quote, "Be eclipsed, O sun, in Gibeon, and thou moon in the valley of Ajalon. And the sun was eclipsed, and the moon turned back, while the nation was avenged on its enemies." Further on, the translation read, quote, "And the sun stayed in the half of the heaven, and set not hastily when a day is done. And there was never a day like that before or since, in respect to Jehovah's hearing the voice of man." Others have suggested that the Earth had actually stopped rotating, which ultimately caused the sun and moon to stand still for 24 hours. It would appear to the people that the sun had stopped when it was, according to some, the Earth that had stopped moving. A similar theory suggests that the Earth was rotating slower. Instead of taking 24 hours to rotate, it had taken 36 to 48 hours. This had given the armies enough daylight to compete and win their battle. There are others who view this passage as a miracle of refraction. This means that the Earth had continued to spin at its normal speed, while God had produced a mirage that made it look as though the sun and the moon had been out of their regular places. He provided more daylight so that Joshua and his army could win the battle, providing him with the necessary amount of light to proceed. In another theory, it was thought that Joshua's prayer had not been for the day to be prolonged, but rather for the sun to stop pouring heat down onto the troops. The prayer had been to stop the light from shining, and not for prolongation. It stated that God had answered this prayer by sending a hailstorm, allowing Joshua's troop to succeed. This sparked the question as to what he had meant. Did he mean for the sun to stop shining, or for it to stop moving? In the midst of a battle, it's unlikely that he would be thinking about the movement of the sun, and the more probable issue would have been the scorching heat. There are those who have suggested that it was not the day that Joshua had asked to be prolonged, but rather the darkness from the previous night. Hugh J. Blair explained that it was assumed that the man would ask for the day to be longer, but it's argued that since Joshua had come up to his enemy by night, then he would not need the prolonging of the darkness in order to plan out a surprise attack. It had been very early morning when the attack ensued, and so it would be understandable that he would ask for the night to be prolonged. The answer had then come in a hailstorm that had prolonged the darkness. The mention of hailstorms has come from verse 11, which states that God had rained down hailstorms on the invading army. There were two strange miracles that had occurred that day. One of them had been the stationary sun and moon, and the other had been the miracle of the hailstorms that had assisted the troops, leading to success. Initially, about 100 years ago, according to the Smithsonian, there was a linguist who believed he may have had the answer. He explained that the word dom, which is a Hebrew term, had been translated to stopped moving, when it should have been interpreted as stopped shining. This could have indicated that an eclipse was in the process of taking place during this battle, and if this was the case, it would be the first ever written piece of evidence recording this phenomenon taking place. However, for the following century, no one had been able to pinpoint a total solar eclipse that would have occurred at a certain time, at a certain place, where it would make sense. This was up until as recently as 2017, when researchers began to look for an annular eclipse where the sun is not covered entirely. Miraculously, they were able to narrow the time frame by comparing information in the Old Testament with Egyptian sources that had made mention of Israelites. This led to the discovery that an annular eclipse had in fact occurred in the right place on the 30th of October in 1207 BC. This could have been exactly what the writer was trying to describe. In 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius erupted and left many scrolls carbonized due to the heat of the pyroclastic flow. The parching had taken place over a relatively short period, in a room that had been deprived of oxygen, resulting in the carbonization of the scrolls. The Herculaneum papyri was discovered in 1752 by workmen for the royal family. After receiving the advice from Bernardo Tanucci, a commission was established by King Charles VII of Naples so that he could study them. It's theorized that the first attempt to read the scrolls had been done by an artist named Camillo Paderni, who had been in charge of the items that were recovered. Various other attempts had been made to read the scrolls, but have been unsuccessful for some time. For the past 2,000 years, the Herculaneum scrolls, consisting of around 1,100 scrolls, have been left unread, and if unrolled would crumble to pieces. At first glance, the scrolls may appear as pieces of coal. The mystery as to what these fragments had read was left unanswered for ages. It was only thanks to AI that we may finally be able to know what was written within these passages. The first ever full word from one of these ancient unopened scrolls have been decoded using computer technology. A team of researchers had initiated the Vesuvius Challenge, which was a challenge that was designed to accelerate the discoveries that had been made on these scrolls. The full word that had been identified was porphyrius, a Greek word that translated to purple. This had initially been found by Luke Ferreter from the University of Nebraska, who was a computer science student and had been a participant in the competition. The contest had called for the participants to apply a technique that's known as virtual wrapping to the rolled up scrolls that were released on the site. This technique was used in an attempt to decipher the hidden script. It's explained that the technique of virtual unwrapping starts with computer tomography, which is an X-ray procedure that scans each of the coiled up and warped papyrus. Once the scan has been completed, the researchers followed along the curves of the letters and then virtually flattened each of the scrolls to explore them further with the use of advanced AI, which had been trained to find ink on the page. This was a technology that had been in development for the past 20 years and was created by Brent Seals from the University of Kentucky, a computer science professor. During the 19th century, hundreds of these scrolls had been pulled apart by a machine, and the papyri was left in fragments. Michael McOsker, who's a postdoctoral researcher in papyrology from the University College London, has not been directly involved in the discovery, but has been studying the scrolls that had been unrolled, causing the papyri to crumble and become difficult to read. McOsker had explained that he was sure that this was a solvable problem by now, and that it may not take as long as you might think to decipher these scrolls. Farrider had not been the only prize winner. Youssef Nader, who's a graduate student, had worked independently from Farrider, but had also found the same word and was able to translate it. The two individuals shared the first letter's prize, which had been $50,000, 40,000 of which was awarded to Farrider and the remaining 10,000 to Nader. But the grand prize of $700,000 of the Vesuvius Challenge for the team that's able to read 4 passages at a minimum length of 140 characters is still available. It's hoped by Brent Seals that a partial deciphering will occur by the end of the year, and that a whole scroll will be readable by the end of 2024. Seals further expressed that there had been people who wrote these scrolls. They wrote of love and war and peace. These are manuscripts of dialogues of philosophy. He further stated that even if we learn nothing but the deep connection we have with our ancestors, it's still rather significant. Experts also hope that the technique used to decipher that one word will ultimately lead to the complete scroll being deciphered. With the use of advanced artificial intelligence that's learned to distinguish ink from papyrus, it started to yield some results. It was found as well that these mysterious scrolls had come from a single room that had been the personal library of Philodemus, who'd been an Epicurean philosopher who'd been employed under Pisa, the owner of the villa. With the use of CT scanning of these scrolls, random letters can be distinguished, but all at random. It was found by Seals that these would first need to be unwrapped digitally, and that the letters would need to be attached to the proper surfaces. And this is how the Vesuvius Challenge began. Seals had been convinced that due to the progress he'd already made, releasing the project publicly would help speed up the process with the offering of prizes. 1,500 individuals have been left working on deciphering these scrolls, and some have found some Latin pieces. Some of the scrolls have been opened and revealed Greek philosophical texts that had related to Epicurus, an Athenian philosopher who believed that everything in nature had been made up of atoms that were too small to see. While some of the scrolls had found their meanings, and some only a mere word, it's left uncertain as to what the other scrolls may have detailed, perhaps something far more frightening. The Parasaurolophus, an herbivore, mainly wandered around the area that's known as Canada today. This creature was one of the more oddly shaped dinosaurs that had left researchers and archaeologists stumped for decades. It featured a duck-like bill and was part of the duck-billed dinosaur group. Additionally, it had a large crest growing out of its head from its nose. This large ornithopod was around during the late Cretaceous period millions of years ago. One question that had the experts wondering had been whether the dinosaur had walked on 2 legs or 4, but it's now believed that they could walk on either. For a rather long time, researchers and scientists have questioned what the crest on the Parasaurolophus's head may have been used for. Finally, that mystery was solved quite recently. Joe Sertich, from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, had led a team on a journey that ultimately led to the discovery of the first new cranium of a rare dinosaur species in the past 97 years. Unbeknownst at the time was that this find would end decades of disagreements between paleontologists on how the head of the dinosaur had grown or evolved. The discovery had been made in the northwestern region of New Mexico, and the museum stated that the artifact had been well preserved, including the bizarre tube nasal passage. It was in May of 2017 when Sertich had led his team of over a dozen volunteers through a federally designated wilderness area called Bisti. Consisting of over 45,000 acres and lack of vegetation and dinosaur fossils, the team would spend several days in this wilderness. While nearing the end of their trip with nothing noteworthy, Erin Spear, the wife of Sertich and a Smithsonian Ecology Fellow, had ventured off by herself. On a cliff, she had seen a small protrusion, which was quickly found to be a fossil. The team was running out of time, and so had returned the next day to begin the excavation. They didn't have to make much of a disturbance in the structure, as the remains were preserved in soft sandstone. Workers had hit some of the remains where they'd not expected to, leading them to believe that they'd found much more than just a few fragments. Over 2 days, the fossil began to emerge and slowly started to take shape. It had been around the size of a donkey's head, which had revealed that they possibly came across a member of the Parasaurolophus family. When the team had realized what they had just discovered, they couldn't believe their good fortune. The individual had jumped around in celebration the moment they'd seen the tube crest, and they were blown away. This would become a rather important discovery as the fossil began to reveal some unanswered questions about these strange-looking dinosaurs. Once it had been excavated from the cliff, the team would cover it with plaster and moist wrappings, and it would be taken to Denver. For the next year, the fossil would be cleaned and prepared for closer inspection and observation. This find revealed the exact structure of the dinosaur's crest after many years of disagreements. David Evan, the Temetry Chair in Vertebrate Paleontology and the Vice President of Natural History at the Royal Ontario Museum, had noted that for quite some time, the idea as to what the purpose of the exaggerated crest had been would range from super sniffers to snorkels that would help the creatures breathe beneath water. Another wild theory suggested that the crest had been used to breathe fire, making the dinosaur a dragon-like animal. Evans further stated that now that this discovery has been made, they believed that the function of the crests had been sound resonators and visual displays that were used to communicate with their own species. Sertich had detailed the crest as an acoustic amplifier. It was likely that the sound would increase as it traveled up the tube-shaped crest. The cranium was dated back to 75 million years prior, when North America had been divided by a sea. This region had populated with similar duck-billed dinosaurs, horned dinosaurs, and tyrannosaurs. This artifact revealed that the crest had formed like other relative duck-billed dinosaurs. Joe Sertich also stated that this specimen had been an incredible example of these creatures evolving from a single ancestor. An NC State paleontologist named Terry Gates was also involved with the team when the remains had been discovered. Gates had explained that there are only 2 of these cranium specimens that have been found of this specific species. When asked why this new artifact was so unique, Gates explained that it's unique due to the fact that it's so well preserved. Usually, the crest gets crushed underneath the weight of the sand, which destroys many important details about the makeup of the crest. It was furthered that some simple math had shown that the longer the crest was, the lower the sound. In other research, it was discovered that the ears of the Parasaurolophus would have been able to hear these sounds, but it's unverified whether or not the ears had specifically been designed for this purpose. The discovery also answered and put an end to the age-old debate about how the crest was structured, as well as what it had been used for. Since the finding of the first cranium back in 1922, 3 Parasaurolophus family members were classified. This classification was based on the shape of the crest. Experts were uncertain if the fossil records had shown 3 different species or 3 different stages of evolutionary development, or even dimorphism. Due to the incredible preservation of the fossil, researchers were able to compare it with a similar one that had been found in Utah that's thought to be a juvenile. Based on an analysis in the PeerJ report, it stated that the most recent Parasaurolophus was a different species and not an evolutionary step for the close relatives. The difference between all 3 of the species is that both of the older examples had longer crests that curved, while the most recent had a short crest that would curve sharply over the back of the cranium roof. Gates had not gotten a look at the specimen until 2019, when he made the venture to Denver after Sertich had invited him there. It was known that Gates had spent a large portion of his career studying the most recent specimen. Based on a previous fossil, he and other paleontologists could only guess as to the actual construction of the dinosaur's head. This had changed when he had a look at the cranium, where suddenly all the answers began to flood in. This had been the missing piece of the puzzle that would fit the other Parasaurolophus species. Just before 7 p.m. on August 7, 1963, workers for Royal Mail, the UK's postal service, began loading bags of letters and parcels to be sorted and distributed around the country. As workers lugged heavy loads onto the train, they had no idea that their quiet night shift would soon turn into disaster. To this day, the Great Train Robbery is considered one of the biggest heists of its kind in the UK. The Royal Mail train consisted of 12 carriages, most of which were filled with staff and bags of letters and parcels. The train regularly ran from Glasgow to London. stopping off in towns and cities across Scotland and England. This allowed letters to be picked up and dropped off wherever necessary, and made for an efficient postal service. The train ran almost daily, but on August 7th there was a special parcel aboard. The second carriage was where all of the money was held that had been collected in Glasgow and was bound for London. According to reports, on any given day, there was usually around a few £100,000 in this carriage. But August 7th was different. August 7th of 1963 had been the summer bank holiday in Scotland, taking the total up to a whopping £2.2 million. The 70-plus staff members on board sorted the post throughout the night, hastily trying to get bags sorted for towns and cities that they were passing through next. At around 3 a.m., the train was passing between Leighton Buzzard and Chiten when the driver, Jack Mills, saw a red signal at Sears Crossing. Confused, Jack asked his co-driver, David Whitby, to get out and see what the problem was. David tried to call the signaling staff, but the line had been cut. Just as David and Jack were piecing together what was happening, David was thrown to the ground. Within seconds, dozens of men had stormed the engine room and began to overpower Jack Mills, eventually rendering him unconscious. David was also unconscious, and then the men could begin their robbing spree. In total, 15 men had waited beside the train, waiting for it to stop, and a handful of them ran to the back of the train where they unhooked 12 carriages. These were the carriages that were carrying letters and parcels bound for London. All that was left was the engine room and the second carriage that contained over £2.2 million. A small group of men then made a beeline for the second carriage. According to the British Transport Police, only 4 people were tasked with guarding the money, and the door to the carriage had been covered with iron bars. These iron bars were no match for the gang, who had brought crowbars and other iron tools. It took them a matter of minutes to mangle the bars holding them back, and they were in. While the men overpowered the staff inside, those in the engine room were trying to wake Jack Mills. They needed him to drive a mile down the road to Bridego Bridge, but he was dazed from his previous wounds. Under threat of further harm, Jack Mills begrudgingly dragged himself to the helm of the train and began guiding it down the tracks. Jack, David, and the 4 other workers in the second carriage were the only ones who had any idea what was taking place. The other 12 carriages were unaware that they'd been unhitched, and they continued sorting post in time for the arrival at 4 a.m. After driving for a few minutes, the train arrived at Bridego Bridge, where the 15-strong crew began to haul over 120 bags filled with cash out of the windows. In total, the gang stole the equivalent of over 2.5 tons and £2.2 million, worth around £30 million today. David and Jack noticed that whoever had pulled off this heist had carefully planned every aspect of it. When they arrived at Bridego Bridge, a convoy of Range Rovers and a military truck awaited them. Before leaving, one of the robbers told Jack and David to stay where they were and wait at least 30 minutes before calling the police. This robber had unknowingly given the police their first clue. Just after 4 a.m., the front 2 carriages at Bridego Bridge saw blue flashing lights ahead and breathed a sigh of relief. The police response had been rapid in light of the amount that was taken. At the scene, police quickly discovered how the 15-strong gang had managed to stop the train. The signal at Sears Crossing had been faked. One of the men had used a glove to cover the proper signal and utilized a battery to power up the stop signal. The police knew that the entire operation required a lot of insider information. The train traveling that day had been one of the only ones not fitted with new alarms to the money carriages. The gang also had to have known that the train was carrying £2.2 million that day, instead of the usual takings of £200,000. They had left behind little to no forensic evidence, and had been careful to conceal their identities. Several forces and agencies became involved in the investigation, but as hours turned into days, nobody was able to come up with any viable suspects. Databases of known British criminals were searched, and several suspects were interviewed at length, but this amounted to nothing. Fingerprints were manually looked over by teams of forensic experts, but any fingerprints left behind at the scene were too small to make any identification. The Great Train Robbery quickly hit the headlines, and the British public flew into panic. If the gang could take on the Royal Mail train and make away with millions, what else would they be capable of? The story of the Great Train Robbery dominated the headlines over the next few days, and everyone in the UK was talking about it. Neighbors became suspicious of each other, and young men were cast in a bad light. It wasn't until the middle of August that the Buckinghamshire police got their first break. During the heist, one of the robbers told Jack and David to wait at least 30 minutes before calling the police, which led them to believe that the robbers' hideout was at least 30 minutes away from the crime scene, and they were right. Around the same time, a resident near Leatherslade Farm in Oakley, Buckinghamshire, had noticed something bizarre happening at the farm. The farmhouse had been empty for many years, and all of a sudden, it had become a hive of activity. Each day, groups of men came and went from the farm, which arose suspicions. With the Buckinghamshire Constabulary finally raiding the farm, they found that the gang had tried to set it alight in a bid to cover their tracks. Investigators found a Monopoly board game, with which the gang had used real money in their games. The Monopoly board and other items provided the police with the evidence they needed: fingerprints. One by one, the British police were able to round up the criminal masterminds behind one of the UK's biggest heists. In all, they arrested Bruce Reynolds, Douglas Goody, Charles Wilson, Ronald Edwards, Brian Field, Roy James, John Dolly, Roger Cordray, Robert Welch, Thomas Wisby, James Hussey, and Danny Pembroke. It would take several years for the police to track down the ringleader, Ronnie Biggs. A few men were able to escape the grasp of the law, including one known only as the Ulsterman. It's believed the Ulsterman was the informant who facilitated the entire robbery. He likely worked for Royal Mail, or had somebody on the inside who knew the ins and outs of the August 7, 1963 route. Only around £400,000 of the $2.2 million was recovered, and some of the notes stolen were old and bound for incineration. The gang had been careful to launder their money, spreading it between family, friends, and legitimate businesses. When the men were finally captured and due to appear in court, the British public stood still. Their cases would become some of the most publicized in British history. Between them, the men were sentenced to serve a collective 307 years in prison. Ronnie Biggs would make headlines soon after his infamous trial, when he escaped the more infamous Wandsworth prison. According to sources, Ronnie snuck out in a furniture van that had been parked beside the prison. Once the officer realized he was missing, it was far too late, and Ronnie was already on his way to Brazil. Ronnie flew from Spain to Australia and then to Brazil, where he managed to evade the law for a stunning 36 years. In 2001, the British and Brazilian police announced that Ronnie Biggs had finally been captured. He was sent back to the UK to serve the remainder of his sentence. The investigation into the Great Train Robbery was one of the most expansive and expensive in UK history, and certainly remains one of the biggest mysteries ever solved by the British police. In 2013, Tasmania influencer Belle Gibson shot to fame thanks to her inspiring and heart-wrenching story. Belle explained how her early life was filled with turbulence and hardships, and how her adult life had not been much kinder. People were drawn to Belle's warm personality and her inspirational story. Despite being just 21 years old, she'd fought off life-threatening diseases and had even beaten cancer. But everything that Belle spouted on social media was a lie, and her deception harmed the lives of thousands across the globe. Belle Gibson told her followers and the media that she left home at the tender age of 12. She lived between homes of family members and friends and continued to pursue her education, whether that was through traditional means or via homeschooling. Tasmania didn't present many opportunities to the young, budding businesswoman, so she packed her bags and moved to Queensland, mainland Australia. Her life was somewhat stable in Queensland, although her friends would later say that Belle flip-flopped between different subcultures, desperately trying to find herself and societal acceptance. In 2010, Belle gave birth to her first child, which was the source of an immense amount of joy and pleasure for her. She relished in the attention she received at being a first-time mother, and continued to lie to people about her upbringing. She told people that as a child or teenager, she had to care for her mother, who had multiple sclerosis, and her brother, who was autistic. Those who knew Belle felt like they didn't really know her, or know the true version of her. She constantly reinvented herself and told everyone a different story about her life. In one instance, she told a friend in Perth, Australia, that growing up, her name had been changed half a dozen times, a claim that was later refuted. Belle's life continued, but as her child grew older, the attention faded. In 2010, Belle announced some terrible news to her friends and the small social media following she had amassed. At the age of 20, she noticed that her health had begun to worsen, and after several doctor's visits, she was referred to an oncologist. In mid-2009, she sat in an office as a doctor told her that she had terminal brain cancer. Not only did Belle have terminal cancer, but she also just had 6 weeks to 4 months to live. Fearing for her life and the life of her child, Belle began to research alternative therapies for her condition. She began posting about her struggles on Instagram and social media, and her natural medicine route appealed to a niche audience. Around this time, she also began to claim that she was suffering from blood, uterine, spleen, liver, and kidney cancer. As Belle posted about her condition, she was welcomed into numerous different groups for cancer sufferers and survivors. She relished in this attention too, and told different groups that she had different forms of cancers. It was in 2010 that Belle also began the journey that would see her rise to stardom. She told the media that after 2 months of intense chemotherapy, she started researching holistic medicine. Belle eventually stopped chemotherapy after just a few months, and instead cut out dairy, gluten, and meat, and opted for a plant-based lifestyle. She also started receiving oxygen therapy and other alternative therapies that would, quote, cleanse her body of cancer. Going under the handle Healing Belle, she amassed a following of over 200,000 people by 2013. People were inspired by her story, and she touted herself as a businesswoman, mother, and cancer survivor. She also claimed to have undergone heart surgeries where she had stopped breathing for minutes at a time. Other cancer and serious ailment sufferers began adopting Belle's way of life in a desperate bid to rid themselves of disease. In late 2013, Belle launched her app, The Whole Pantry, which aimed at empowering people to discover the true value of what she dubbed superfoods. People truly believed that Belle, who had just been given months to live in 2009, had somehow overcome her terrible disease by ditching modern medicine. But to others, something didn't seem quite right. In 2014, Belle's empire only grew with the launch of her book, which accompanied the content featured in her app. Hundreds of women around the world ditched modern medicine for holistic therapies, all of which Belle promised would rid them of their ailments, as it had done for her. Little did she know she was placing her followers in a very dangerous position. Following the launch of her book, the list of those who questioned Belle began to grow longer. In her book, she claimed to have been cancer-free, but in interviews, she claimed that the cancer had returned. She gave conflicting interviews to different outlets, claiming that the cancer was in different places. Her followers slowly began to realize that things were not adding up. But how could they prove that she was lying? As her fame grew, her views became more and more controversial, and she chose to push an agenda that endangered lives by promoting a culture of fear around modern medicine. In 2015, people had finally gathered enough evidence to put the mystery to bed once and for all. Had Belle been lying about her mental health conditions? She refused to give the names of the doctors who had operated on her, or give proof of her conditions. The mystery was finally solved in April of 2015, when Belle appeared in an interview with an Australian Women's Weekly. She admitted to lying about having terminal cancer, and also admitted to having never donated $300,000 to various charities, as she had promised from the proceeds of her app. Her empire crumbled around her, and the Australian public began to turn on her. In response to these lies, Belle was fined $410,000 for making fraudulent claims about her charity donations. Since her lies were exposed, Belle has kept a low profile and no longer posts to social media. In 2023, British TV channel ITV produced a documentary titled The Search for Instagram's Worst Con Artist. Belle refused to appear or comment in the documentary, but her brother, the brother she claimed to have cared for, does. He refutes all the stories about Belle's early life, stating that she didn't care for him or his mother, nor do anything around the house. How deep Belle's lies go remain a mystery, but her holistic empire has well and truly toppled. August 31st, 2004 was set to be another unremarkable day in Richmond Hill, Georgia. At around 5 a.m., the employees on the early shift at the Richmond Hill Burger King shuffled into the restaurant and prepared for a busy breakfast shift ahead of them. One of the employees was tasked with taking the trash outside to the nearby bins. She grabbed the bags and made her way to the bins, only to stop in her tracks. Someone or something was laying behind the bins. Little did she know that her discovery that warm early morning would spark a mystery that would span over 11 years. As the employee was taking the bags to the bin, she noticed something behind one of the bins. As she drew closer, she gasped in shock. Laid there was a middle-aged white man, completely nude and with an obvious head injury. He wasn't conscious and had severe sunburns. She immediately ran inside and dialed 911 before running back to the man to assist him. When paramedics arrived, they discovered the man was unconscious but breathing and had a steady heart rate and pulse. He had suffered trauma to the head and ant bites along with severe sunburn. He was immediately transferred to the nearest hospital for emergency treatment, but this is where the mystery would begin. As the man lay in his hospital bed and awoke from consciousness, he asked the staff where he was. After they explained that he was in the hospital after suffering numerous injuries, the man appeared more confused. Hours later, doctors and nurses tried to ask the man his name and if there was anyone they could call, but bizarrely the man couldn't recall his own name. Hoping that the amnesia was temporary, they left him to recover. When they returned the next morning, the man was unable to identify himself, which raised major red flags for staff. Without a name, the staff took to calling him the Burger King John Doe. As the man spent more time recovering, pieces of his life slowly began coming back to him. He told doctors and nurses that he believed his name was Benjamin. Staff at various hospitals where he was held contacted police in the area, but no one by that name had been reported missing. After several weeks, Benjamin was cleared for discharge and was sent to live at the Grace House Men's Shelter. Unfortunately for Benjamin, there was little he could do, as he was suffering from serious cataracts that made it impossible for him to see more than a few feet in front of him. Without knowing his name or social security number, medical staff were unable to access his insurance, and he was left untreated. In 2005, a charity funded Benjamin's cataract operation, and he was able to get around much easier. In exchange for room and board, Benjamin began working at the J.C. Lewis Health Center, as he was unable to leave because he had no social security number. During his time at the J.C. Lewis Health Center, Benjamin met Catherine Slater, who was determined to help him get to the bottom of the mystery that had been plaguing him for years. With Catherine's help, parts of Benjamin's life slowly came back to him. He told medical staff that he remembered living in Indianapolis and the University of Colorado. In place of his surname, Benjamin chose Kyle, becoming Benjamin Kyle. His story quickly hit social media and the headlines, and people across the US were enamored by his story. After years of rehabilitation, he revealed that he may have been traveling through Richmond Hill in August of 2004 because of a hurricane that had swept through the area, although he couldn't be sure. In 2007, the FBI became involved thanks to Catherine Slater, and they began scouring databases using Benjamin's fingerprints. Catherine also called the Richmond Hill Police Department and was disappointed to discover that they'd failed to open an investigation after Benjamin was found in 2004. As technology evolved, the FBI also offered to take a DNA sample from Benjamin, which was analyzed against thousands of known DNA profiles. Despite the amount of time and effort that went into his case, nobody was able to identify him. As the years went by, Benjamin tried to find a job and live a normal life. But without a social security number or documentation, he found it impossible. In 2010, Benjamin submitted another DNA sample to renowned genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick. Colleen and her colleagues hoped to harness the emerging technology of genetic genealogy to finally put to bed the mystery of the Burger King John Doe. According to reports, Colleen scoured databases and found distant relatives of Benjamin with the surname Powell. Unfortunately, just as things were taking off with Colleen, Benjamin cut off all contact. It wasn't until 2013 when Benjamin was ready to delve into his past again when he contacted C.C. Moore, a world-renowned genealogist. Thanks to DNA and genealogical technologies, C.C. was able to track down Benjamin's identity after years of working on the case. In late 2015, the mystery of the Burger King John Doe was finally solved when Benjamin announced his real name was William Burgess Powell. William, or Bill, was born on August 29, 1948, in Lafayette, Indiana. In 1976, Bill left home to escape a turbulent home life and fled to Boulder, Colorado. According to reports, Bill worked various odd jobs across the city to make ends meet. His family in Lafayette did file a missing person report, but little progress was made in the case in 1976. Bill stayed in Colorado until 1983, and after that his whereabouts were unknown until his discovery in 2004. When interviewed, his brother, Furman Powell, said the family believed he was deceased as he hadn't contacted them for so many years. What happened in the interim years remains a mystery, and it's likely we'll never know. After discovering his true identity, Bill returned to Lafayette, Indiana, to be with his remaining family, where he remains to this day. September 11th, 2001, was a day that changed not just America, but the entire world's political climate. Decades on, the harrowing story of September 11th has been burned into the memory of every American and everyone else worldwide old enough to remember the attacks. It's changed the way we board planes, with extra layers of security and checks to ensure it never happens again. Hundreds of documentaries, books, and podcasts have been made on the topic, but there's one topic that remains in the dark: those who faked 9/11 survival stories. September 11th, 2001 was a day that the Earth stood still. Citizens from around the world rushed to their TV sets to catch a glimpse of what was happening. The footage on screen seemed more like it was from a movie than real life. Reporters across New York City rushed to the site of the Twin Towers to report on the tragedy that was unfolding. And news crews captured footage of first responders bravely risking their lives to save those trapped in the rubble. The days and weeks after the attack felt surreal for the citizens of New York City, and slowly, one by one, survivors began being released from the hospital. By early 2002, many survivors had begun to foster online communities where they could talk about their experiences and the crippling survivor's guilt that engulfed them. In 2004, a new name joined the discussion: Tanya Head, and she told a woeful tale of survival and guilt. Tanya joined the World Trade Center Survivors Network after the founder, Gary Bogach, learned of her online activity. The two quickly struck up a friendship, and Tanya became a staple member of the group. According to Tanya, she had been on the 78th floor of the South Tower on the morning of September 11th. Moments after realizing what had happened, Tanya described having to crawl through the rubble of smoke and fire to escape before eventually being rescued by a firefighter. In one of her messages, she wrote, quote, "I looked around and it was like a horror movie. People were mounted on top of each other. The smell was gagging. I kept thinking about my fiancé and about our wedding. I wanted to wear the white dress and swear my love to him." Further in her message, she introduced her fiancé, Dave, who'd been working on the 100th floor of the North Tower that morning. But unfortunately, Dave didn't survive, leaving Tanya heartbroken. What made Tanya's story so believable was the way she weaved uneventful details into her story of epic heroism. She described how she and Dave had gotten into an argument that morning, and how she'd been rescued with a man wearing a red bandana. After being dragged to safety, Tanya claimed the next thing she remembered was waking up in the hospital where she was being treated for her injuries. She claimed that during the attack, her arm had almost been severed, and that she had suffered severe burns to her arms as a result of crawling through the burning rubble. As the group began to amass more members, more and more people began to doubt her story. The group amassed Tanya a small amount of fame, and she appeared in interviews on local TV. What stood out to members was Tanya's inconsistencies. One minute, Dave was her fiancé, the next, he was her husband. Tanya told fellow survivors that she and Dave had actually had a non-legal commitment ceremony in Hawaii shortly before 9/11, and the two were due to get married in October of 2001. As Dave was deceased, according to Tanya, there was no one to back up her claims. Another detail that stood out to Tanya's friends was the absence of her dog, Elvis. A key element to her story was that she and Dave had lived together with their beloved dog, Elvis. But whenever friends visited Tanya, Elvis was always on a walk with someone else. The more people began to delve into Tanya's background, the more they truly began to question her story. Many noticed that she didn't have the injuries one might expect from serious burns and an almost severed arm. While there were serious doubts surrounding Tanya's story, nobody openly questioned her on account of not wanting to appear rude or accusatory towards someone who'd clearly suffered and lost so much. Tanya continued to run the World Trade Center Survivors Network until 2007, when a major publication would run a story on Tanya's deceit. In September of 2007, the New York Times ran a piece titled, "In a 9/11 Survivor Tale, the Pieces Just Don't Fit." This was the first time the world would be alerted to Tanya Head, and this is where her empire of being a survivor fell apart. The New York Times laid out all the evidence they had uncovered that showed Tanya's story was fraudulent. There was no record of Tanya ever attending Harvard as she had claimed in her posts. There was also no record of her being in a relationship with a man named Dave, and no record of her working in the South Tower in September of 2001. After several months of digging, the New York Times explained in their article that they'd uncovered the real identity of Tanya Head. Tanya Head was born Alicia Esteve Head in Barcelona, Spain, to wealthy parents who gave her everything she could have ever asked for, including Arabian stallions. Disturbingly, it was discovered in 2001 that Tanya, Alicia, was actually enrolled as an MBA student at ESADE Business School in Barcelona, Spain. It wasn't until 2002 that Tanya moved to New York and adopted the name Tanya. Tanya's story made headlines, with actual 9/11 survivors stating their fury at Tanya's false claims. In 2022, further details emerged in Tanya's case. Reporters discovered that Dave, Tanya's false fiancé, was in fact a real person, but the relationship had been fabricated without his knowledge. Tanya had likely admired him from afar and made him the subject of her affections. Tanya never faced any charges for her lies, a move which angered hundreds of survivors. She's since returned to Barcelona, where she prefers to keep a low profile. In 2023, Colby Richards enjoyed an idyllic life in Spring, Texas, with his wife Callie Richards and their 2 children. The pair had worked hard to curate their ideal lives, and years of hard work had finally led them to it. To the outside world, the pair appeared to have everything, but deep down, something troubling within Colby was brewing. It wasn't until May of 2023 that this darkness would be exposed, leading investigators on a wild hunt to find Colby before it was too late. In March of 2023, Colby started a new job as an electric distribution design technician, a job he had sought after for a while. According to his wife Callie, Colby was excited about his new role and where it would take the family. On the morning of May 26, 2023, Callie awoke shortly after 5 a.m. with a strange feeling. As she looked to the other side of the bed, she noticed that her husband was missing. After searching the home, Callie immediately ran for her phone to call 911. Her husband was nowhere to be found, and she knew something was wrong. In her call to local authorities, she told them that her husband was missing and hadn't been seen since the night before. She told them that Colby usually awoke around 5 or 6 a.m. to get ready for work. By 6:30, he was usually out the door, but on May 26th, he was nowhere to be seen. When investigators arrived at the home, Callie directed them to the back gate. She told them that while Colby sometimes took quiet morning walks and meditations before work, he left through the front gate, not the back. That morning, the back gate had been left wide open, leading her to believe that Colby had entered the woods behind their home. As investigators searched the area, they found a thermos belonging to Colby, with warm coffee still inside, confirming he'd likely headed through the woods. As the hours ticked by, Callie waited patiently, hoping Colby would return, but he was nowhere to be found. When he left that morning, he'd left behind his phone and wallet, making him completely untraceable. Investigators quickly discovered that the woods behind the Richards home led to the Greenway Trail, which gave investigators a dash of hope. They believed that Colby may have set out for an early morning hike and gotten disoriented. They immediately appealed to hikers in the area to be on the lookout, but nobody recalled seeing Colby. The Montgomery County Sheriff's Office also began searching the Greenway Trail on foot, utilizing officers and volunteers. For several days, the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office and Colby's family and friends scoured the woodlands, but no sign of him could be found. Callie stayed at home, hoping her husband would return any moment soon, but as the days went by, her hopes slowly began to fade. After a week, the official search by the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office was called off due to a lack of evidence. What puzzled investigators most about Colby's case were the circumstances of his disappearance. He and Callie had not been arguing in the days or hours before his disappearance, and everything was okay at home. Colby was enjoying his new job and didn't express any feelings or thoughts of harming himself. He left behind no evidence aside from his coffee cup. Nobody in the area had recalled seeing him, and he'd not been in contact with his friends or family. As days turned into weeks, publicity around the case waned, and Colby faded from the public eye. Still, his family and friends were determined to keep his case alive, and canvassed areas of interest and placed missing person posters around Spring. On June 2, 2023, Colby's case took a bizarre turn when the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department announced that he'd been found safe and well. In later publications, they announced that they'd found Colby wandering on Research Forest Drive in an area called the Woodlands, around 3 miles from his home in Spring, Texas. They also announced that it was the search and rescue team Gulfsar who had discovered Colby wandering in the wilderness. Jake Stovall, the founder of Gulfsar, stated that when they found Colby, he was in a bad way, telling the Daily Mail, quote, "He was coherent but very dizzy and had a depleted mental state. He was confused and hiding it, and appeared he didn't want to be found." Colby was taken for a mental and physical health evaluation following his recovery, with the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department commenting, quote, "Mr. Richards is being evaluated by the MCHD medics and Montgomery County Sheriff's Office Mental Health Unit. Detectives will eventually speak with Colby Richards about the circumstances surrounding his disappearance, but it'll be some time before he's interviewed." While neither Colby nor Callie Richards have commented on his disappearance since it occurred in May of 2023, Colby's colleagues did speak to Fox News about his mental state in the days before his disappearance. They commented that Colby appeared tired, which they considered normal for a man with 2 small children, but they did notice that he was zoning out at his PC. The real reason for Colby's disappearance may be hidden for some time, but his family are just glad that they can finally put this mystery behind them. 35-year-old Carol Jean Pierce lived a quiet, unassuming life in Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin. By 1966, Carol had been wed and divorced twice, with one of the marriages producing a son, Mark. Everything changed for Carol in September of 1966, when she married Richard Gale Pierce. At first, the two shared a whirlwind romance, but slowly the cracks began to show. By 1975, Carol was living a very different life. When she mysteriously disappeared, all eyes fell on her husband, and investigators would later uncover a bizarre clue that unraveled the entire case. Richard was a member of the U.S. Coast Guard, and as a result, he and Carol moved around the U.S. frequently while he was on duty. In 1973, the two finally decided to settle in Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin, and Carol assumed the role of a housemaker and homemaker. To the outside world, Carol and Richard looked just like any other couple, but behind closed doors, trouble was brewing. Neighbors would report hearing the couple embroiled in screaming matches and arguments. According to Carol's friends and family, Richard often got physical during these arguments, which terrified Carol. The two lived at the Sunrise Shores Trailer Park close to the USCGC Mesquite, where Richard was stationed. One of Pierce's neighbors later told investigators that he often saw Carol with black eyes and bruises. Those in the park felt powerless to help Carol, as she didn't want to file a police report, and life for the Pierce family continued as usual. Behind her husband's back, Carol began to save up small amounts of money to aid in her escape. She had dreamed of finally being free of her abusive husband, but before Carol could get the chance to flee, she disappeared. September 8, 1975, marks the last day that Carol Pierce was ever seen alive. Richard said the two had breakfast over coffee that morning before he left for work. By the time he got home, Carol and the $20,000 from their savings account was gone. Instead of being filled with worry, Richard was filled with anger. A missing person report was not filed in the hours after Carol's disappearance, and Richard began telling everyone that she had taken off. Richard even told Carol's family that she had walked out on him, taking their life savings. Carol's family demanded that the police and Richard take action. However, their cries fell on deaf ears. After Carol disappeared, Richard acted as if she had never existed. 2 weeks after her disappearance, he retired from the Coast Guard and threw a large party. When guests and colleagues asked where his wife was, Richard told them the same story. She'd left him high and dry. On September 22, 1975, Richard left Sturgeon, Wisconsin and drove their trailer home to Michigan. According to Richard, the couple planned to move to Michigan following his retirement. He showed little to no interest in his wife's disappearance. Carol Pierce was not finally reported missing until November 29th of 1975, 82 days after last being seen. In October of 1975, just a month after his wife disappeared, Richard began dating Rose Marlene Box. The community and Carol's family were outraged by the lack of investigation by the Sturgeon Bay Police Department. They were of the opinion that Carol was an adult who could do whatever she wanted. It wasn't until the 1980s, when new detectives were brought on board, that the police started to take her case seriously. Investigators restarted the investigation, starting at the beginning. When they spoke to the U.S. Coast Guard, they discovered that on September 5th, Richard had been granted leave, returning on September 6th. They now began to consider that Richard was somehow involved in his wife's disappearance. 2 years after she disappeared, Richard petitioned for divorce and married his new girlfriend, Rose Box, in 1978. Investigators also discovered that shortly before her disappearance, Carol had signed over the titles to a plot of land and a truck to Richard. They also realized that with Carol out of the picture, Richard would have his new home in Michigan and his Coast Guard pension all to himself. By 2008, the Sturgeon Bay Police Department agreed with these conclusions. It had taken them several decades, but they were finally on the same page. And that year, investigators executed a search warrant on Richard's home. During their search, they established that in 1975, Carol left behind her beloved 1970 Chevy pickup, her purse, makeup, and her cat. They also discovered a slab of concrete with a strange cut in it. In 2018, the Wisconsin Cold Case Review took another look at the case and Richard's property. This time, the cut in the concrete was gone. The Wisconsin Cold Case Review also brought in cadaver dogs, which hit on the scent of human remains 6 times around Richard's home. Despite a full excavation of the area, Carol's remains were never found. Both authorities and the Cold Case Review team gathered their evidence together and kept searching. Finally, in October of 2008, the now 82-year-old Richard Gale Pierce was charged with the disappearance of his wife, Carol. In April of 2022, the trial of 86-year-old Richard came to a close. The prosecution and the defense presented their arguments to the jury, and the defense argued that without a body, there was no evidence that Richard had been involved. After 9.5 hours, the jury returned with a verdict, guilty. Richard Pierce was sentenced to life in prison without parole. As he was led out of the courtroom, he flashed a peace symbol to onlookers. Life for 11-year-old J.C. Duggard had already been filled with ups and downs. Her biological father, Ken Slayton, was not in the picture, and her mother had remarried. J.C. was now navigating the realities of a blended family, a stepfather and a half-sibling. In 1990, J.C.'s mother informed her that they were moving from Arcadia, California, to South Lake Tahoe, a small town 600 miles away. J.C. and her family left everything they knew behind for a new beginning. She was upset about leaving her friends behind, but her parents assured her that the move was positive. Her mother told her that South Lake Tahoe was a much safer area for her and her sister to grow up in, and that they would flourish in this new environment. Little did the Duggards know that evil was lurking behind the idyllic townhouses of South Lake Tahoe. By June 10th of 1991, JC had somewhat settled into her new life. She was a 5th grader at her new school and was slowly getting used to being in a different environment. JC had made a few friends. By all accounts, she was an ordinary 11-year-old girl. That morning, she woke up for school, ate breakfast in a hurry, and threw on her favorite pink jacket. She said goodbye to her stepfather, Carl, and she began the short walk to the bus stop. As JC powered up the hill, not wanting to miss the bus, she noticed a gray car slowing down beside her. As the car rolled to a halt, the man driving the car wound down his window and began to speak to JC. He asked her for directions, but this was all a ruse. In her most vulnerable moment, the man in the car signaled to his wife to grab JC and throw her into the car. She was just a stone's throw away from her home when she was kidnapped, and her stepfather Carl witnessed it all. At first, Carl couldn't believe what he was seeing. He rubbed his eyes as if he were in a nightmare. He saw JC in her favorite pink jacket being hauled into a car by a man and a woman. When the car began to speed away, Carl grabbed his bike, desperately trying to save his stepdaughter. Unfortunately, he was no match for the car, and he helplessly watched as it sped off into the distance. Carl now had the horrific task of calling his wife and telling her that her daughter JC had just been abducted. When Terry got the call from Carl, her whole world fell apart. She immediately returned from work and drove to the South Lake Tahoe Police Department to file a report. The SLTPD sprung into action and took statements from Carl, Terry, and other possible witnesses to the abduction. Witnesses described a gray car rolling up next to JC, and within seconds she was gone. A man and a woman were seen in the car, but nobody knew who they were. The SLTPD began their search for JC, retracing her last steps and desperately hoping to find her. News of JC's abduction hit the evening headlines, and the small community of South Lake Tahoe were left shocked. Their town was once regarded as a safe and quiet place to raise children, and now it had become the scene of every parent's worst nightmare. Neighbors, residents, and community leaders took to the streets, helping the SLTPD however they could. Leaflets and flyers were plastered across town. Others physically searched for JC, checking creeks, lakes, and wooded areas. The shocking abduction of JC Dugard hit national news days later, and now the eyes of the country were on South Lake Tahoe. JC's missing person poster was sent nationwide, and businesses across California and the US placed JC's photo all around, hoping that someone would recognize her amongst a crowd of people. Little did everyone know JC was alive and being held captive in one of the most deplorable environments ever discovered. After being forced into the car by her captors, JC was driven to Antioch, over 160 miles from her home in South Lake Tahoe. Terrified and alone, JC was dragged into a shed on the property of her captors. Her captors taunted her, telling her that the shed was soundproofed and that guard dogs were waiting for her outside if she tried to make a run for it. JC would spend the next 18 years of her life in this tiny, dilapidated shed. Throughout those years, JC displayed an astounding level of mental fortitude. Her instincts and will to survive to one day see her family again kept her going, even throughout her darkest days. For 18 years, JC was subjected to assaults, beatings, and mental manipulation. In 2003, JC wrote a diary entry saying, quote, "How can I ever tell him I want to be free, free to come and go as I please, free to say I have a family?" In 2005, JC wrote, quote, "It feels like I'm sinking. This is supposed to be my life to do what I like, but once again, he's taken it away. How many times is he allowed to take it away from me? I'm afraid he doesn't see how the things he says makes me a prisoner." JC's parents held memorials for their daughter each year, appealing to the public for more information. On November 30th, 2006, the Contra Costa County Sheriff's Office received a call from a concerned neighbor in Antioch. The neighbor stated that Philip and Nancy Garrido had some anomalous activity going on at their home. The neighbor told investigators that they'd seen two young children living in a tent in their backyard, and that Philip's behavior was increasingly erratic. The Contra Costa County Sheriff's Office responded to the call, but Philip Garrido assured them that everything was fine. The shed that JC Dugard was being kept captive in was just meters away from where the sheriff's deputy stood. Had the sheriff's office thoroughly searched the property, they may have discovered JC sooner. JC stood and watched as the sheriff's office left. She hoped and prayed that one day someone would demand to search the property and that she would be saved. By 2009, JC was 29 years old and had bore two children to her captor. On August 24th of 2009, JC finally had her chance to escape. Philip Garrido and the two children he bore with JC went to the University of California, Berkeley to obtain permission to preach his religious ideas on campus. Incredibly, the staff at UCB noticed that something wasn't quite right. The two girls were shy and pale and appeared robotic. One of the girls had a bump on her head, which she said was a birth defect, but the officers knew something was amiss. The staff at UCB did their due diligence and contacted the campus police, who ran a background check on the fanatical Philip. They quickly discovered that he had a long record of assault and kidnapping. While they couldn't hold him, Allie Jacobs found Philip's parole officer from his prior stint in prison for kidnapping and contacted them to arrange a welfare check. On August 26, 2009, parole officers arrived at Philip and Nancy Garrido's home, where they'd held J.C. Duggard captive for 18 years. J.C. was present in the home during this visit, and at first she told officers that her name was Alyssa and that she was married to Philip. It was clear to officers that J.C. appeared terrified of Philip and wasn't answering questions truthfully. Officers gently coaxed Alyssa into telling the truth. Philip was separated from Alyssa to make her feel more comfortable. After hours of interrogation, Philip Garrido finally admitted that he and his wife had kidnapped Alyssa in 1991. Upon hearing that Philip had confessed, Alyssa broke down in tears and cried and said, "I'm J.C. Duggard." The parole officers froze, and a wave of shock and disbelief washed over them. The Concord Police Department were called to the scene, and after 18 years of captivity, J.C. Duggard was finally free. The police took in J.C. and her daughters, and the FBI also assisted. 29-year-old J.C. was reunited with her mother, Terry, who had never stopped looking for her. Following a lengthy trial with mountains of evidence, Philip Garrido was found guilty on multiple charges and was sentenced to 431 years in prison. His wife, Nancy, who aided in the kidnapping, was sentenced to serve 36 years to life. In the wake of her reappearance, J.C. has embarked on a long road to recovery. She told the press that she felt guilty about having a bond with a monster who had held her captive for 18 years. She has also written 2 books about her ordeal and now campaigns and advocates for others like her. J.C. was awarded $20 million. Andrea Sincata had spent her life in Arlington, Virginia, raising her son Kevin as a single mother. The pair shared an incredibly tight bond, and when Andrea met James Christopher Johnson, Kevin was happy for his mother. The relationship between Andrea and James blossomed, and eventually the pair became engaged. Everyone around Andrea saw how the relationship had positively impacted her life. Many thought that the two would wed sometime in the future and then be able to start their lives together. The two had planned to build their dream home, as James had worked in construction, but tragedy struck before these plans could be put into motion. By 1998, Andrea was 52 years old and James was 36. Andrea worked as a librarian at Arlington Library and was known to be a hard-working and dependable employee. August 21st of 1998 was Andrea's day off, and she planned to make the most of it. She'd planned to meet a friend for lunch after going about her morning routine, but Andrea never showed up. Alarmingly, Andrea also missed her date with her fiancé, James, and he waited outside the movie theater for her. According to James, after Andrea failed to show up, he assumed she was out with friends and returned home to await her arrival. That evening, Andrea didn't make it home. James would later tell investigators that evening he went to bed, hoping to feel Andrea slipping into the sheets beside him in a few hours. At around 1:30 a.m., he was awoken by a strange feeling. The closet door Andrea always insisted on keeping open was shut. James sensed something wasn't quite right, and as he opened the closet door, he stumbled across a horrific scene. He had just discovered his fiancée's body slumped inside their bedroom closet. James panicked and ran to the nearest phone, summoning the Arlington County Police Department to the scene. James immediately became suspect number 1, but investigators failed to find any bruises or injuries to Andrea at the scene. There was no sign of a struggle and very little evidence to work with. James was taken to the police station for interrogation, and after hours of questioning, he cracked. James told investigators his memory of that night was hazy, but he remembered hitting Andrea until she lost consciousness. It was at this point that investigators knew James wasn't involved. They had just received the coroner's report, which stated that Andrea had suffered pressure to the neck. James had made a false confession, and their investigation was back at square one. Andrea's family held a funeral service, burying her in the Mount Lebanon Cemetery in Maryland. Her family were frustrated to hear that James had been let go without charge, and her son Mark was determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. With James out of the picture as a suspect, Mark, Andrea's son, turned his attention elsewhere. Just weeks before the crime occurred, a man named Bobby Joe Leonard had been at Andrea's apartment to take away an old PC. Mark and James were furious with Andrea as she let an unknown man into the apartment while she was alone. Mark couldn't help but feel that something was off about Bobby, and he was right. By 1998, Bobby Joe Leonard had accumulated an array of criminal charges and arrests. He'd been charged with armed robbery and assault, and victims of Bobby's brutality were slowly coming to the forefront. In 2000, a woman was found with similar injuries to Andrea, and she told investigators that her attacker was Bobby Joe Leonard. For his crime, Bobby was sentenced to life in prison. Investigators working on Andrea's case strongly suspected he was involved, but had no evidence to prove it. Years would go by without any updates, but in 2013, the Arlington County Police Department's cold case unit decided to reopen Andrea's case. Progress slowed until 2018, when Detective Rasia Araldi decided to visit Bobby Joe Leonard. Detective Araldi had been assigned to the case and was eager to get Bobby's account of the crime. For years, Bobby had denied ever being involved, but something inside of him clicked when faced with Detective Araldi. Just minutes into the interview, Bobby Joe Leonard admitted to taking Andrea's life, but that wasn't all he had to tell Detective Araldi. A few short sentences later, Bobby would drop a shocking twist in Andrea's case that shook Araldi. While Bobby had admitted to hurting Andrea, he had done so as part of a paid hit. Just days before Andrea was found, Bobby received a phone call from a man that he believed to be James Christopher Johnson. James instructed Bobby on what to do on August 21st, and he said that he would leave him $5,000 in the closet. Bobby told investigators that he had never found the money that was promised to him. Following this confession, charges were brought against both men, and their cases were taken before a jury. In October of 2022, James Christopher Johnson stood before the jury as they were given the evidence. In a shocking twist, the jury deliberated for just 1 hour before returning a verdict of not guilty. Bobby Joe Leonard was not so lucky. The jury found him guilty, and he was given an additional life sentence. He's currently being held in the Wallens Ridge State Prison in Stone Gap, Virginia. 53-year-old Karen Moore was known as a kind and caring woman. Her kind nature lent itself to her nursing profession at a local hospital in Davie, Florida. Karen had also recently gone through a divorce from reports, and it appears as though it was a tumultuous process. Fox News reported that Karen had obtained a restraining order against her estranged husband during the divorce proceedings. Unfortunately, little information is available, and we don't know what caused Karen to take out the restraining order. While the divorce was going through the courts, Karen focused on her job as a nurse and on being a mother to her 8-year-old daughter, Christina. By 2001, Karen and Christina were living in Davie, Florida, with the support of her family. On June 26, 2001, Karen left her home at about 7 p.m. and was never seen or heard from again. It's believed that she was on her way to collect her daughter from a Girl Scout camp. Karen never arrived, and Scout leaders desperately tried to contact her. Witnesses and neighbors confirmed that they saw Karen leaving her home in a white 1999 Saturn with license plate D00THU. The next day, she failed to attend work at the hospital. Her family was immediately notified, and the Davie Police Department launched its investigation. As Karen was going through a divorce and had filed a restraining order against her soon-to-be ex-husband, investigators set their sights on him. Following multiple searches and interrogations, investigators found no evidence of his involvement. Karen and her beloved car had disappeared under bizarre circumstances, and there was no sign of either. The searches for Karen and her car continued, but with few leads to work with, investigators found themselves at a dead end. As previously mentioned, little information is available about Karen's case or the subsequent investigation, and it's unclear where or how the Davie Police Department conducted its searches. Karen's case would fall silent for over 22 years. On January 6, 2023, Karen's case would take a shocking turn. Two independent dive teams, Depths of History and Sunshine State Sonar, who voluntarily offered their services to bring answers to grieving families, teamed up to conduct searches in the Broward County area. During one of these searches in a pond off of Davie Road and Nova Drive, the divers came across a white 1999 Saturn. Inside sat the remains of an adult woman with dark hair. The car was immediately pulled from the water, and the Davie Police Department were called to the scene. Using vehicle records and license plates, the Davie Police Department confirmed that the car recovered belonged to Karen Moore, who disappeared in 2001. Further tests on the remains found in the car concluded that they belonged to Karen. Currently, investigators are still working to uncover what happened to Karen. The search teams told Fox News that finding Karen's car took 10 to 15 minutes. Her family were heartbroken to learn that she'd been sitting at the bottom of a pond just miles away from her home all these years. The Davie Police Department has stated that they're investigating the possibility of foul play being involved, and no further comments have been made. Anybody with additional information is asked to contact the Davie Police Department's Criminal Investigations Unit at 954-693-8200. Thomas Hayden was born and raised in Leonardtown, Maryland. Throughout his life, he moved around the US looking for new opportunities and experiences. After leaving Maryland, Thomas headed to Louisiana, where he volunteered as a firefighter and worked as a police officer. When his career came to a close, he moved to Woodbridge, Virginia to be closer to his family in Maryland. In 1998, Thomas met Virginia Fogel, and the two instantly hit it off. Virginia had been married several times before, and Thomas also had a daughter, Kim Via, from a previous marriage. Despite their past relationships, Thomas and Virginia seemed to be a happy couple. Shortly after meeting, the two married and decided to travel around the US in a trailer. This arrangement seemed perfect for the pair for many years, as Thomas had undergone spinal surgery years prior. Little did Thomas's family know that the woman he'd vowed to spend the rest of his life with would come to be the face of evil. According to reports, the last confirmed sighting of Thomas was in late 2011 in Dover Township, Pennsylvania. His family confirmed that he attended a doctor's appointment on September 27, 2011, and that contact with him ceased shortly after this date. Thomas's family repeatedly tried to contact him, but each time Virginia told them that he wasn't home or didn't want to talk to them. On one occasion, she told Kim Via, Thomas's daughter, that he'd said something particularly cruel about not wanting to speak to her. Kim knew this was very out of character for her father, who adored her. Kim knew her father as a strong, outgoing man who loved his family deeply, and she knew he would not be out of contact with them. Many Christmases and birthdays passed without a word from Thomas. During one phone call, Virginia told Kim, quote, "He doesn't want you or his family to bother him. He hates all of you." This cruel statement did not dissuade Kim from trying to reach her father. In December of 2011, Thomas's father, Elbert, passed away. Everyone in the family hoped that this somber occasion would bring Thomas out of the shadows, even if he didn't want anything to do with them. Again, Thomas could not be reached and was not part of the funeral plans. When the funeral arrived, Thomas never showed up, and Kim knew something was very wrong, but she couldn't prove that her father had met with foul play. The family continued trying to speak to Thomas, and even made several attempts at trying to visit him in the flesh. Each time, Virginia had a reason why they couldn't visit. In 2016, Kim traveled to Maryland to visit some of her family when she came across some of her father's old friends by chance. Bizarrely, one told her that her father had passed away some time ago. Kim wasn't sure what to think of the bizarre statement, and she returned home with even more questions swirling around in her mind. Just hours after she arrived home, her phone buzzed. It was Virginia. In a text, she said, "Your father wants to know why you're spreading lies back home." This final encounter confirmed to Kim that something was amiss with her father, and she was right. In 2017, she contacted the local authorities and asked them to perform a welfare check on her father. She stated that she had not spoken to him in several years and that his wife Virginia was acting odd. The Pennsylvania State Police became involved in the case and visited an address that Thomas's family had been given. When there was no sign of him, they went to the Dover Township home that Thomas and Virginia had bought. When they arrived, they found that the apartment had been sold for $135,000 to another person unrelated to the family. Interestingly, records revealed that in 2013, Thomas sold his half of the condo to Virginia for just $1. With Thomas having last been seen in 2011, investigators began to wonder whether these documents had been forged. Pennsylvania State Police finally caught up with Virginia and interviewed her. She told them Thomas had left Dover Township in 2011 for Mexico to get ALS treatment. Bizarrely, Thomas's medical records showed no indication that he had ever been diagnosed with ALS or needed treatment. Virginia's story slowly began to fall down around her, but she stood by her story. Investigators also discovered that Virginia had continued collecting Thomas's Social Security payments after he left for Mexico. According to the Charlie Project, Virginia is estimated to have pocketed around $115,000 after Thomas disappeared in 2011. It was discovered that there was only one debit card that had access to this account following Thomas's disappearance, and that card belonged to Virginia. While searching her property, the police found Thomas's passport, driving license, Social Security, and Medicare cards. Following this, Virginia was charged with theft, forgery, and tampering with public records. This arrest encompassed the fraudulent purchase of the apartment for $1, where she had signed her husband's name. In the wake of this interview, Virginia would claim that Thomas was abusive towards her. Kim, Thomas's daughter, also corroborated this claim. She told investigators that she and her father had been estranged for a while due to his behavior. While the police now had an air of suspicion that Virginia was involved in Thomas's disappearance, they had no hard proof. Then they remembered a disturbing discovery that had been made in January of 2012. On Conewago Road, close to the Conewago River, a queen-sized bedsheet and a food saver bag had been found by passers-by. Inside the bag were pieces of hair and a human scalp. This was in close proximity to the home of Thomas and Virginia, but DNA tests at the time came back inconclusive. By 2017, technologies had advanced significantly, and forensic genealogy had become increasingly popular with the forensic community. This time, investigators asked Thomas's brothers, Spencer and Owen Hayden, to submit a DNA sample for comparison. Incredibly, test results revealed that the DNA found in the food saver bag had a 403 billion to 1 chance of being from a sibling of Spencer or Owen. This confirmed to investigators that it indeed did belong to Thomas. Virginia was also known to have a food saver system. Perhaps most disturbingly of all, Virginia is said to have had morbid conversations with her children and grandchildren, telling them that she would feed someone to pigs and that they would eat everything but the skull and hair. Virginia maintained her innocence, but following the shocking DNA results, she was arrested and charged in connection with Thomas's disappearance. Unfortunately, until Virginia talks, we'll likely never know what really happened. In September of 2022, 71-year-old Virginia entered a plea of no contest, whereby a defendant does not admit guilt but accepts the sentence. This occurred just hours before a jury selection was made. Virginia was only charged with 2 out of 66 counts as part of this plea agreement, and she was sentenced to 6 to 20 years in prison, with 7 years of probation. The homicide charge was downgraded from first degree to third degree as part of the plea deal. Virginia Lynn Hayden is currently being held in the State Correctional Institution Muncie in Clinton Township, Pennsylvania. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.